It was a cold afternoon in the winter of 2015, and 57 old Patricia Duray was asleep on her couch inside her home in France. She had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, and she decided to spend it relaxing, just watching a movie. But at some point, she'd clearly drifted off. The sound that woke her was the familiar ding of her cell phone. Patricia slowly opened her eyes, feeling groggy and a bit disoriented. She blinked a few times, letting her living room come back into focus. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, the credits rolling. She must have been out for a while. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone to see who had messaged her. The screen lit up showing a new text, but it was from a number she didn't have saved in her contacts. She tapped on the notification, and the message that appeared on her screen was strange, to say the least. It read in French, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." For a moment, Patricia just stared at the words, completely baffled. It made no sense at all. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. She scrolled up, and that's when she saw there were other messages in the thread from this same number, messages she had received months ago. And in that instant, she remembered exactly who this was. The person sending these cryptic texts was a middle-aged woman named Bérengère. About 8 months before this, Bérengère had approached Patricia while she was out in public. She had seemed frantic, telling Patricia that she was in desperate need of her help. The reason, Bérengère had explained, was that she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. Now, for most people, this would be a very strange request to receive from a stranger. But for Patricia, it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. You see, in addition to being a well-respected local news reporter, Patricia Duray was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium. She genuinely believed she had the ability to communicate with the dead, and it was a part of her life she was very passionate about. In fact, she was quite famous for it throughout France. Because of her public profile, both as a journalist and as a medium, she attracted a lot of attention. People would often come to her with stories of paranormal activity. They'd claim their house was haunted, that they'd seen a ghost, or that strange things were happening that they couldn't explain. Patricia always tried to approach these situations with an open mind, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew that most of the time there was a perfectly logical explanation. More often than not, when she would follow up on these claims, she'd discover that the ghostly whispers were just drafty windows, the footsteps in the attic were the house settling, and the eerie shadow was just a trick of the light. There were rarely any actual spirits to communicate with. So, the vast majority of the time, when someone approached her with a story about a haunting, she took it with a grain of salt. When Bérengère had first come to her 8 months ago, talking about a haunted castle, Patricia's internal reaction was basically, sure it is. She was polite, of course, but she didn't really believe it. Bérengère, however, had been very persistent. She was clearly distressed and desperate for help. So, mostly just to be kind and to end the conversation, Patricia had given the woman her phone number. Almost immediately after, Bérengère had sent her a couple of texts, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them, filing it away as just another likely dead end. But now, 8 months later, here was Bérengère again, texting her with this bizarre and dramatic message about a castle calling for her. For some reason, this time, it was different. Maybe it was the strange wording of the text, or maybe it was just the fact that Patricia had a rare day off with nothing else to do. Whatever it was, her interest was piqued. She found herself feeling a strange sense of inspiration, a little pull of curiosity. She decided she would actually follow up on this one. She was going to go check out this castle and see for herself what this supposed haunting was all about. About an hour and a half later, Patricia's car pulled up in front of a small, charming cottage. The cottage was situated on the same large property as the castle. From her earlier brief text exchange with Bérengère, she knew this was where the woman lived. Patricia parked her car, got out, and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knocked firmly, then waited. There was no answer. The air was still and quiet. After a few moments of silence, she knocked again, this time a little louder. A moment later, the door creaked open. But the person standing in the doorway was not Berenger. It was a middle-aged man, and he looked completely confused to see a stranger standing on his doorstep. The look on his face was one of pure bewilderment. Seeing his confusion, Patricia immediately launched into an explanation. She said, "Hello, I'm looking for Berenger. I'm Patricia." We were just speaking via text message. The man just continued to stare at her, his expression not changing. He seemed to have no idea what she was talking about. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment. But then, from behind the man, Berenger appeared. As soon as Berenger saw who was at the door, her entire demeanor changed. Her face flooded with relief, and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was about to start weeping with joy. She rushed forward, pushing past the man. "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. We really need your help." Before Patricia could even ask a question or get a word in, Berenger gestured towards the confused man who had opened the door. By now, his expression had softened a little, though he still looked a bit lost. "This is my husband, Remy," Berenger said. "And he is just as relieved as I am that you're here." At this, Patricia offered the man a polite smile and shook his hand. She turned back to them both and said, "Well, I don't know yet what I can do for you. Why don't you start from the beginning and fill me in? All I really know is that you believe the castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" Berenger took a moment to compose herself, wiping a tear from her eye. She took a deep breath and then began to explain. About a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the full-time caretaker for the historic castle on the property. As part of the job, they were given free housing in this very cottage. She had come along to help him with the upkeep. At first, she said, they were both thrilled. It was a wonderful opportunity, a beautiful place to live, and a steady job for Remy. But their excitement didn't last long. Berenger told Patricia that they had only been living and working there for a couple of weeks when the strange things started to happen. She explained that she would often be in the castle by herself, doing her daily chores like cleaning or dusting. She would know for a fact that she was the only person inside the huge, empty building. And yet, she would suddenly hear the clear and unmistakable sound of footsteps, people walking, and sometimes even running around on the floors above her. At this point in the story, Remy chimed in, speaking for the first time. He said, "Yes, I've heard it too. I've heard those same footsteps, and I know the castle is totally empty." He looked at Patricia with wide, earnest eyes. "But it's even stranger than that," he continued. He said he would be working inside the castle and he would hear voices. And he wasn't talking about faint whispers that you might hear in a movie. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs. The screams would come from distant, unseen parts of the castle, and he said it was absolutely terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Berenger tell their story, she was struck by how genuinely frightened they were. They weren't being dramatic or trying to sensationalize anything. It was clear that whatever they had experienced inside that castle had deeply shaken them. They seemed trapped. Remy's job required him to be there, to go inside the castle every day, but it was becoming an increasingly difficult and stressful ordeal for both of them. They felt like they had nowhere to turn and that no one would take them seriously. Patricia couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for them. They came across as honest, ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary and frightening situation. But at the same time, her professional skepticism was still there. She was a veteran in these matters. She had been on numerous house calls to supposedly haunted locations. She knew that screams could be the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in a window, and footsteps could be a raccoon in the attic or a pet walking around somewhere else in the house. There could easily be a rational explanation for everything they were describing. But their fear was so palpable, so real, that she knew it warranted a closer look. There was enough here to convince her that she needed to see the castle for herself. So, after they finished their story, she looked at them both and said, "Okay, let's go over there." Let's go see the castle. A few minutes later, Patricia was following Berenger and Remy along a wooded path that led from their cottage to the castle. Even from a distance, the castle was an imposing sight. It was huge and intimidating, with two very tall round towers on either end. In the middle was a slightly shorter section, decorated with a cluster of smaller turrets that reached up towards the gray sky. The front of the castle, the side they were approaching, only had two visible windows. For a fleeting second, as Patricia looked up at them, she had an uneasy feeling that the windows were like two giant eyes, and the castle itself was watching her approach. She quickly shook the feeling off, telling herself not to get carried away, and kept walking. A few moments later, they arrived at the castle's massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood. Remy pulled out a huge, old-fashioned key ring that was heavy with dozens of keys. He found the right one, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud, metallic clank. Then he pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside, gesturing for Patricia to go inside first. Patricia took a steadying breath, trying her best to remain professional and objective. She was not going to buy into the hype just yet. This could still be something completely normal. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the castle, she found herself in an enormous, empty space known as the Great Hall. The first thing she noticed was how incredibly dark and cold it was inside. Of course, it was an old stone castle, so a certain level of cold was to be expected. But this felt different. It was an eerie, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air itself felt heavy, thick, with a kind of oppressive silence. It was not a welcoming place. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and leave immediately. Patricia took another deep breath, trying to center herself and focus on the task at hand. She looked around the Great Hall more closely. There were a few windows on the far wall, but their heavy wooden shutters were all closed tight, plunging the room into shadow. Directly in front of her was a grand, sweeping stone staircase that led up to the upper floors. To her right and to her left, she could see long, dark hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of other rooms. After a few moments of just taking it all in, Patricia turned to Berenger. She said, "Okay, so you mentioned you've heard footsteps upstairs when you knew this place was empty. Can you remember what you were doing on any of those occasions? What were you doing the last time you heard the sounds?" Berenger thought for a second and then nodded. "Actually, yes, I do remember," she said. "The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on those windows over there. And I know I heard people walking around upstairs while I was doing that." Instantly, Patricia's practical mind went to work. That could be it. Maybe the sound of the old heavy shutters moving was creating some kind of echo or vibration that in this cavernous space could be mistaken for footsteps. It was a plausible theory. "Okay," Patricia said, "let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if that could be causing the strange sounds you're hearing." Berenger and Remy didn't seem offended by her suggestion at all. In fact, they seemed eager to find a rational explanation for what was happening. They wanted it to be something simple. So, the three of them walked over to one of the large windows. Patricia reached out, grabbed the wooden handles of the shutters, and pulled them open. Then she pushed them closed. She did this a few more times, listening carefully. But there were no strange sounds. There was the creak of the old wood and the thud as they closed, but certainly nothing that could be confused with the sound of footsteps running around upstairs. It was a dead end. This was not the explanation. Still, just to be thorough, Patricia decided she would try one of the other shutters. Maybe one of them was faulty or made a different noise. She walked over to the next window and reached for the shutter. But before her hand even made contact with the wood, a loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed through the entire castle. It seemed to come from somewhere high above them on one of the upper floors. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the castle was plunged back into a deadly, unnerving silence. Immediately, the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. It was an unmistakable sound, a human-like shriek of terror or pain. She turned to look at Remy and Berenger. They were both frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had obviously heard things like this before, but it was clear that it was just as terrifying every single time. Patricia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, not sure what to do next. She forced herself to stay calm. Wait a minute, she told herself silently. That couldn't have been what it sounded like. There has to be a logical explanation. Part of the reason for her skepticism was that even in all her years as a psychic medium, she had never experienced anything so direct, so visceral. A ghostly scream was something you saw in movies, not something that happened in real life. So she turned to the terrified couple and said in a calm voice, "Look, I obviously heard that too. But let's not rule out that it could have been the wind or something else. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic. Let's just search the castle and see what we're dealing with." Remy and Berenger did not look reassured in the slightest, but they nodded meekly, willing to follow her lead. But before anyone could move, before anyone could even take a step, it happened again. Another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence, this time from a different location upstairs. It sounded like a different voice. And then, once again, it was gone, leaving only a ringing in their ears and a thick, heavy silence. At that moment, it became very clear to Patricia and certainly to the couple that this was not the wind. The castle might just be haunted after all. There was something very wrong happening here. As Patricia stood there, trying to process what was happening and figure out what their next move should be, because she was now, by default, the expert in charge, a powerful and strange feeling came over her. She would later describe it as a pull, like a magnet was inside her, pulling her in the direction of where the screams had come from. She felt an overwhelming and undeniable urge to go upstairs, to the second floor, to find the source of those sounds. She felt like she had to. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a compulsion. She wasn't even sure if it was her own psychic abilities kicking in, or if it was the castle itself drawing her deeper into its shadows. Without saying a word to Remy and Berenger, without even a glance in their direction, Patricia silently turned and began to walk, almost as if against her will, towards the huge stone staircase that led to the upper levels. The castle was now completely silent again. The only sound was the soft echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor as they moved towards the stairs. Remy and Berenger, their faces masks of terror, huddled closely behind Patricia, following her lead, not knowing what else to do. Up the stairs they went. Patricia was still in the grip of that intense feeling, that pull that she couldn't control. Up and up the stone steps she climbed, with the frightened couple close behind. No one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their shoes on the stone. They went all the way up to the third floor, which is where she felt the screams had most likely originated. At the top of the stairs, Patricia, acting almost on instinct, turned to her left and started walking down a long, dark hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors on either side. Again, the castle was unnervingly quiet. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Down the long hallway they walked, all the way to a dead end. And at the very end of the hallway, there was a single closed door. At this point, Patricia, almost as if she were a different person, turned and spoke to Remy in a sharp, almost aggressive tone. "Get your keys out," she commanded. "Open this door." She didn't even know why she was being so forceful. The words just came out of her. Berenger, however, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The owner of the castle," she whispered, "they told us this is the one room we are not allowed to go in. We've never been inside. We can't go in there." Patricia just looked at her, her expression unyielding. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." Berenger looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Remy just gave a slight shrug. They were in way over their heads and had no idea what to do. They figured they had to trust Patricia. She was the expert after all. So Remy pulled out his big ring of keys again. He fumbled through them, his hands shaking slightly, trying to find the right one. Patricia stood there, practically vibrating with the need to get into that room. She couldn't understand the feeling, but it was all-consuming. Finally, Remy found the key. He reached out, put it in the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open, and Patricia immediately walked inside. As the door swung open, Remy and Berenger got their first look inside the forbidden room. And it was completely unremarkable. It was just a vacant, empty room. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing at all. There was no obvious reason why this specific room would be off-limits. But as they stood in the doorway and watched Patricia walk slowly and methodically to the center of the room, they could have sworn they heard the faint sound of whispers suddenly starting up inside the empty space. Patricia came to a stop in the very middle of the room, her back facing them. And then things got even stranger. Patricia, who was now acting very differently from the calm professional who had first arrived, just stood there, rigid, staring towards the back wall of the dark room as the whispers seemed to grow louder. From their vantage point in the doorway, Berenger and Remy watched in horror as Patricia's body began to twitch. Her shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and her neck snapped to the side at a strange angle. And then she began to let out a horrible, croaking sound. It was a constant, single-tone, guttural noise. It went on and on for so long that it seemed impossible. She should have needed to take a breath to continue, but she didn't. The sound just emanated from her, relentless and unsettling. Remy and Berenger were now terrified, not of the castle, but of Patricia. As she was twitching and croaking, she suddenly stopped, whipped around, and faced them. Her mouth was hanging open, her jaw completely slack, and that awful croaking sound was still coming out of her. But they could also see that she was weeping. Tears were streaming down her face. Remy and Berenger were beyond terrified, but they could also see that Patricia was in some kind of crisis, and they wanted to help. They were just about to ask her what was wrong, what they could do, when a loud slamming sound echoed up from one of the lower floors. It sounded like a heavy door had been slammed shut with incredible force. The noise seemed to snap Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. Her expression changed in an instant. She became focused, alert. And then, without a word to the couple, she bolted right past them, sprinted out of the room, and ran down the hallway and down the stairs. She was chasing after the sound. Remy and Berenger looked at each other, stunned. What else could they do but follow her? So they ran down the hallway, several paces behind Patricia, who was already somewhere on a lower floor. They got down to the second floor and could hear movement coming from one of the rooms down the hall. Then they heard a loud, almost animalistic yelling sound. It seemed to be Patricia, yelling or growling or something from inside one of the rooms. They cautiously made their way in that direction and saw an open door that led into a bedroom. Off of the bedroom was a small bathroom. They went into the bedroom and looked into the bathroom. And there was Patricia. Her back was to them, and she was on her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She was looking up at something in the room, something they couldn't see. They could see her face from an angle, and it was contorted in pure horror. She was looking at something that was terrifying her, but to them, the bathroom was completely empty. Remy and Berenger didn't hesitate. They rushed into the bathroom and grabbed Patricia. She seemed to resist, not wanting to leave, but they were stronger. They dragged her out of the bathroom, pulled her to her feet, and literally, forcibly, removed her from the castle out into the fresh air. Several hours later, Berenger and Remy were back inside their cozy cottage. They were sitting in their living room, with stacks of old papers and historical documents scattered all over their coffee table. Sitting with them was Patricia. By this point, she was mostly back to her normal self, but she was still visibly shaken by what had happened inside the castle. She was now able to explain to the couple what she had experienced from her perspective. She told them that she had, in fact, gone into a kind of trance, a psychic medium experience unlike any she had ever had before. This was on a completely different level. It was visceral and terrifyingly real. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked, forbidden room on the third floor, the room was not empty for her. When she was pulled in there, what she saw was a room filled with people, entities, or ghosts. Berenger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. She said they were all wearing different kinds of clothes, from different time periods. There were people dressed in medieval peasant outfits, women in Victorian dresses, and men in 20th century business suits. But the most powerful impression she got was not their appearance, but their emotional state. She could feel how lost and scared these spirits were. They seemed to be in trouble. Patricia said she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then anchored there, unable to move. As she stood there, these ghosts began to crowd in on her, getting closer and closer, as if they were desperately trying to get her help. She felt overcome by a suffocating, claustrophobic feeling. It wasn't their physical presence that was overwhelming her, it was their sadness. Their collective loneliness and desperation washed over her in waves, and it was so powerful and so awful that it made her weep uncontrollably. Eventually, she said, she was able to force her body to turn around and at least look towards the exit. That's when she heard the loud slamming door from downstairs. The sudden noise seemed to startle the spirits, and they backed away from her, which gave her the chance to bolt from the room. Patricia then explained that when she ran out and started heading in the direction of the slammed door, the feeling of being pulled was very different. The pull that had led her up to the third floor had felt neutral, maybe even positive, like something was guiding her to help. But this new pull, leading her down to the second floor, felt totally different. It was dark. She knew that something evil was pulling her towards it. But still, almost against her own will, she ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and into that bedroom, with Berenger and Remy following behind. When she went into the bathroom, she saw something so terrifying that she just collapsed to her knees and began to scream. That was the animalistic wailing that the couple had heard. What she saw was an enormous, tall, Guzek figure. It was the ghost of a man, covered in deep scars, wearing rusted chainmail armor, like a knight from a long-forgotten time. She said he radiated pure evil. It was a dark, malevolent presence. She knew that was the source of the dark feeling that had pulled her there. She felt like it was trying to pull her to her death, and she believes that it was only because Remy and Berenger came in and physically pulled her away that she was able to escape. After Patricia finished her incredible story, the three of them sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had to figure out what it all meant. They quickly decided to focus on the most immediate threat, the evil entity, the tall man in the rusted armor. Who was he? And what did he want? Berenger and Remy had already gathered up a bunch of historical documents about the castle, and they had spread them out on the coffee table. Together, they started going through them, looking for any clue that might explain who this terrifying spirit could be. As they were looking through the old papers, one particular section caught Patricia's eye. She felt a strange pull towards it, a feeling that she needed to read it. It was a section about a knight named Jean who had lived in the 14th century. The document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between England and France. During that war, the castle had been used as a French military fortress, and Jean, the knight, had been killed in a battle that took place right there at the castle. After Patricia read this out loud, she told Berenger and Remy that she just had a feeling. She couldn't explain why, but she was certain that the evil spirit she had seen in the bathroom, the tall man in the armor, was the ghost of Jean. However, even if she was right, it didn't solve their problem. They still didn't know why he was there, why he had appeared to her, or why any of this was happening, and who were all the other ghosts in the room on the third floor. None of it made any more sense. Berenger eventually looked at Patricia and asked, "What do you think all this means? What do we do?" But Patricia was still deeply shaken. She was a renowned psychic, but she had never experienced anything this intense. It was truly terrifying. She just shook her head and said, "Look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about all of this. I need to process what happened here." Remy and Berenger were obviously disappointed, and probably terrified at the thought of being left alone with the haunted castle, but they understood. They couldn't force her to stay. So, Patricia got up and left, leaving them alone with their fear. After she was gone, Berenger and Remy made a pact. They agreed that even though it was Remy's job to look after the castle, it was just too dangerous to go inside for now. They would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could figure out what to do. For the next couple of days, life was surprisingly normal for them. As long as they stayed away from the castle, nothing strange happened at all. They just lived in their cottage and tried to go about their lives. But Patricia didn't call, and she didn't come back. She was at her own home, trying to come to terms with her terrifying experience. And during this time, Berenger started to feel a strange sensation in her chest. It was a feeling of needing to go to the castle. It was a pull, very similar to what Patricia had described. She tried to ignore it, to fight it, but the feeling just grew stronger. She felt this undeniable compulsion to go over there. Then one day, Remy was looking out the window of their cottage, and he saw his wife, Berenger, walking purposefully across the lawn, straight towards the front door of the castle. He knew immediately what was happening. He thought there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed. He ran out of the cottage, raced over to her, and literally grabbed her and pulled her back just moments before she could go inside. When he pulled her away, she seemed to snap out of it, and she couldn't even explain why she was there. She just said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come over here." But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened in those few days. Shortly after that incident, a random man had wandered onto the castle grounds. He didn't seem to know why he was there, but he too was being drawn towards the castle. As this man was walking towards the front door, a deer, which also seemed to be drawn to the castle, came running out of the woods and rammed into the man with incredible force. He was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized, and he actually lost an eye in the incident. After this happened, Berenger and Remy knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had been trying to give Patricia her space, but things were escalating. The dark energy in the castle seemed to be getting stronger, its influence spreading. They had to get in touch with her. Berenger called Patricia and told her everything that had happened. She said, "Whatever's going on in that castle, whatever dark energy is in there, it's getting stronger." At first, Patricia was not eager to return. She had made a conscious decision to stay away. The experience had terrified her, and she didn't want any part of it. But as she listened to Berenger on the phone, she could hear the sheer desperation in her voice. Berenger and Remy were at their wits' end. They were lost, and they were turning to her not just as a psychic, but as a friend. They needed her help. So, reluctantly, Patricia agreed to go back. The following evening, the three of them were back inside the castle. They were standing in the second-floor bathroom, the very same room where Patricia had encountered the terrifying entity she now believed was the ghost of Jean. Patricia had come back to attempt an exorcism. She stood in the middle of the small bathroom, while Berenger and Remy huddled together behind her near the doorway. Berenger was so scared she was physically shaking. They watched as Patricia, despite her own fear, stood there calmly with her eyes closed. She was trying to channel the energy in the room to connect with the spirit of John. After a few moments of silent concentration, Patricia seemed to connect with something that Berenger and Remy couldn't see. The room was empty to them, but it was clear that Patricia had found what she was looking for. Then, out of nowhere, her voice boomed through the small bathroom, loud and stern. "Jean, show yourself." Berenger and Remy stared at her, their hearts pounding. Patricia opened her eyes and looked around the room, and then her gaze locked onto something on the other side of the bathroom. She could clearly see something that they couldn't. Patricia, her eyes still fixed on whatever was in the room with them, spoke again in that same loud, commanding voice. "It's over," she said. "You have to move on." She was speaking directly to the entity, to Jean, telling him that his time was up. For a long moment, there was just silence. Berenger and Remy held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Was Patricia going to go into another trance? But she remained calm, forceful, and anchored to the spot. Nothing happened. It was completely silent. Then Patricia repeated her command, her voice even stronger this time. "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after she spoke, they all heard it. The sound of banging on a door coming from the third floor directly above them. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, dozens of them, all over the place. And then the sound of mournful crying. There was more banging. Berenger and Remy clutched each other, terrified. But Patricia remained unmoved, a rock in the center of the storm. And then, suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of a door flying open upstairs. This was followed by the sound of all those footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed with the sound of crying. But the crying had changed. It was no longer sad. It sounded like blissful crying, like tears of pure joy, as a crowd of spirits charged down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the castle forever. And then, just like that, it was over. A profound calm fell over the entire castle. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. Patricia turned away from whatever she had been looking at in the bathroom and faced Remy and Berenger. She was smiling. "It's over," she said softly. "It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia later explained to them what had happened. She had been able to channel the ghost of Jean. He had been haunting the castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a kind of purgatory, believing he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. For centuries, every time someone died in or around the castle, he would take their spirit and hold it prisoner in that locked room on the third floor. But when Patricia had told him it's over, he understood that she meant the war was over. And at that moment, Jean himself was the one who freed all the prisoners. That was the sound they heard, all the spirits being released, joyful and free at last. And then Jean's own spirit was finally able to find peace and move on. But there is one final strange twist to this story. A short time after the exorcism, when life had returned to normal for everyone, Patricia and Berenger were talking on the phone. At one point in the conversation, Patricia said offhandedly, "You know, Berenger, it's a good thing you texted me again and got me to come back out there. Clearly, I was able to help." "What a good thing it was that you texted me." And Berenger replied, "What do you mean?" Patricia said, "You know, when you texted me that the castle was calling me." "You were right." "It was, and I came over and we took care of it." But Berenger was confused. She said, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send you that message." Patricia, surprised, pulled out her phone and found the text. She read it back to Berenger. "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Berenger insisted, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Berenger, and Remy still have no idea who or what sent that fateful text message to Patricia's phone. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back in the spring of 1978, a 16-year-old girl named Bridget Geiger was sitting in her bedroom in Ohio, staring at her prom dress. It was a beautiful dress, and she had spent weeks looking forward to this night, but as the date drew closer, she felt a heavy sense of disappointment. She did not have a date to the prom, and she had been worried that she would have to miss the event entirely. But then, a boy from her school named Jeffrey had asked her to go. Bridget was not particularly excited to go with Jeffrey. He was known around school for being incredibly quiet, highly unusual, and extremely nervous around girls. She figured it was going to be an incredibly awkward date, but nobody else had asked her, and she really wanted to go to her high school prom. So, she said yes. On the night of the prom, Bridget got dressed and waited on her front porch. When Jeffrey finally showed up, she was immediately disappointed. He was wearing this odd ensemble of a vest and a bow tie as opposed to the standard tuxedo that she was anticipating him wearing. They did not match at all, and it was clear from the start that they were on two completely different pages. He was also so nervous that he was visibly shaking. His hands were trembling so badly that he could not pin her corsage to her dress. Seeing how much he was struggling and how tense the situation was, Bridget's mom had to come out of the house and put the corsage on for her. After the corsage was finally on, Bridget's mom wanted to take some photos of them. They stood together on the front lawn, but they were incredibly stiff. They looked like two strangers who had been forced to stand next to each other for a photograph. After her mom took a couple of very awkward photos, they ultimately got into Jeffrey's car and headed off for the prom. When they arrived at the school, Bridget immediately wanted to go onto the dance floor to see her other friends. She hoped that being around a larger group of people would lighten the mood and make things less awkward because she was really not having a good time with Jeffrey so far. But she did stay with him, and as they walked around, it became very clear that Jeffrey absolutely hated being at the prom. He hated being around this swarming group of teenagers, and the loud music and bright lights seemed to make him incredibly anxious. Bridget felt kind of bad for him and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, do you want to go sit down and just grab a bite to eat over at the little food cart they have here?" Jeffrey looked incredibly relieved. He looked at her and said, "Yes, I would love to do that." And so the pair left the loud dance floor and walked over to the quiet food court area. As they were about to sit down, Jeffrey pulled the chair out for Bridget. She sat down, and he kind of pushed her in like a gentleman. But then, instead of sitting down with her, Jeffrey just walked away without telling her where he was going. Bridget assumed he was just going to the bathroom, but after a really long amount of time had passed, it was clear he had not just gone to the bathroom. She got up to go look for him. She went onto the dance floor, but she could not find him in the building. And so she went outside to see if maybe his car was gone. She thought maybe he had just left her there and driven home. But when she looked, she saw his car was still in the parking lot. When she turned around to go back into the building, she saw Jeffrey sitting on a curb all by himself, just eating McDonald's cheeseburgers. She walked over to him and asked, "What are you doing out here?" Jeffrey looked up and told her that he had just wanted to step outside and get a couple of cheeseburgers, and then he was going to come back and sit with her while she ate. But the school staff would not let him back into the building because of their strict rules about leaving. And so he had just gone back to McDonald's, got more cheeseburgers, and decided to wait there on the curb until she came outside. Now that she was outside, she could not get back in either. So she just sighed and said, "Hey, I would like to just go home." Jeffrey was mortified. He told her, "I am so sorry. I wanted this to be a nice evening for you, and I am sorry it was not." He drove her home, said goodbye, and she walked into her house. He drove off, and that was that. Bridget only saw Jeffrey one more time after that night. It was about a week after the prom, and Jeffrey actually invited her to come over to his house for what he was calling a house party. Bridget was very skeptical. She thought to herself, there is no way this kid is throwing a house party. He can barely stand to be around just me, let alone a crowd of people. But she wanted to be polite, so she said, "Sure, I would love to come to your house party." When she arrived, she realized her instincts were entirely correct. There was no food, there was no music, and there were only about 3 people there. And as soon as she walked in, all Jeffrey wanted to do was have a seance and communicate with the devil. Bridget was so immediately creeped out by Jeffrey's behavior that after only a couple of minutes, she just turned around and left his house. She did not see him again after that day. Well, she did not see him again until 13 years later when she would read about him in the newspaper. 13 years later, on the 22nd of July 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin police spotted a man named Tracy Edwards running down the road in handcuffs. They ran over to him and asked what was going on. Tracy was terrified. He said that a man was holding him hostage in his apartment and had threatened to kill him. Tracy explained that he had been able to overpower the man and escape, and now he was running for his life. The police went to the apartment that Tracy had escaped from, walked up to the door, and knocked. The door opened, and the police were confronted by a tall man who introduced himself as Jeffrey. He told the police that this was all a big misunderstanding. He said that Tracy was a friend of his, and he did not know what had gotten into him. The police were actually close to believing him. They would even say later that Jeffrey was incredibly convincing, calm, and polite. But as they were talking to him, one of the officers kind of looked behind Jeffrey into his apartment. On the coffee table in the living room, the officer saw what were clearly pictures of dismembered body parts. The police immediately moved in and arrested Jeffrey. When his apartment was fully searched, a complete house of horrors was revealed. In addition to the photos of body parts, the apartment itself was littered with human remains. There were several human heads in the freezer and the refrigerator. In his bedroom, there was a massive 57-gallon drum containing more dead bodies that were decomposing in harsh chemicals. There was also undeniable evidence that suggested Jeffrey was eating his victims. Jeffrey lived in a crowded apartment complex, and other neighbors had complained about this awful putrid smell coming from his room. But he had been able to explain it away and convince everybody that his freezer had broken and it was just some bad meat. However, the most horrifying revelation about how Jeffrey was able to conceal these horrible crimes in the middle of a busy city apartment would come a few days later during the investigation. Apparently, 2 months before Gersie Edwards had run out of the apartment in handcuffs, another boy had managed to leave the apartment in handcuffs and was running down the road. Police officers stopped him, but the boy could not really speak. He was dazed, confused, and was not able to articulate why he was there or what he was doing. As the police were talking to him, Jeffrey came running up the road. He flagged the officers down, thanked them for finding his boyfriend, and said they had just gotten into a lover's quarrel and everything was fine now. And so the police shrugged it off. They said no problem, and they even gave Jeffrey and the boy a ride back to the apartment. They watched them go inside, and then the police left. But if the police had paid just a little bit more attention, they would have seen there was a small hole drilled in the back of the boy's head. Jeffrey had been pouring acid into this kid's head to try to control his mind, and that was why the boy could not speak. And as soon as the police let them go back into the apartment, Jeffrey killed the boy. It turns out that Jeffrey, Bridget's prom date, was none other than the infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 people over a 13-year period. Just days after the picture was taken of Jeffrey and Bridget standing on her lawn right before they headed off to the prom together, Jeffrey Dahmer would kill his very first victim and start his 13-year killing spree. Dahmer was ultimately given multiple life sentences, but in 1994, he was killed by another inmate while serving his time in prison. And so, while some monsters hide in the open in crowded apartment buildings, others seem to manifest in the absolute silence of the deep woods. Fast forward to January of 2004, where a 16-year-old girl named Misty Tasker was living a typical life as an American teenager in Live Oak, Florida. Live Oak is a very small, rural town right in the middle of the state, surrounded by dense forests and dirt roads. One Saturday evening in January, Misty and her mother attended a local church service. Afterwards, they hopped into her mother's pickup truck, got onto the country highway, and began making their way home. Their house was just a 20-minute drive down this highway. It was a straight shot, but this highway was incredibly desolate. There were no streetlights, and despite being called a highway, it was actually a dirt road. It was just thick, dark forest on both sides of the road the entire way, with no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would always keep both hands tightly on the steering wheel. She would sit up, hunch over the wheel, and keep her eyes intently focused on the road ahead. But at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight, which made it difficult for her to judge distances in the dark. Because of this, she went to great lengths to never drive at night. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother was driving with the sun starting to set. She was going as fast as she could to try to get home before it got too dark. As they were bombing down this dirt road at about 55 miles per hour, despite it being a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who was in the passenger seat, just happened to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she was looking at her, she noticed out her mother's side window, it looked like there was a little girl sitting on the side of the road. Misty was confused. What would a young child be doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She turned to her mom and said, "Mom, I think I just saw a little girl." But her mother, who was high up on the wheel and completely focused on her stressful driving, did not hear Misty the first time. She was just staring at the road, trying to get them home. And so Misty said it again, louder. "Mom, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she is doing out here, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she is okay." Misty's mom looked over at her. She was not prepared to turn the car around. Turning around meant staying out later, and it meant she would have to drive in even darker conditions, which she absolutely hated. And so she looked at Misty and said, "Did you really see someone? Because we really need to get home." And Misty said, "Mom, I am pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back." Finally, Misty's mother, though she was very annoyed, stopped the truck. She performed a careful three-point turn on the narrow dirt road and began driving back up the road towards where they had come from. They had only made it about half a mile from where Misty believed she had seen the girl. And so, pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, "I think she is in this area." They both began scanning the right side of the road, which was where the girl would be now that they had turned around. It was starting to get very dark outside, but there was still enough light, and they had their headlights, so they were confident they would be able to spot her. As they were slow rolling down the road, they both saw the girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was completely turned to the road. She had her knees tucked up tightly to her chest, and she was slowly rocking back and forth in the dirt. Misty's mother made a comment that it was extremely surprising that this girl was out here. There was really nothing around. There were no houses, no buildings, and no trails to be walking on. It was just thick, overgrown forest on both sides of the road. She thought it was very strange that this girl would be out here, especially since there was absolutely no other traffic on this road. Misty's mother began slowly rolling the truck up to her. She told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, they should drive past her first to get a good look at her, and then they would turn around and see if she needed any help. As they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but definitely not a child. And as they drove right past her, they expected her to turn around and acknowledge the truck creeping up on her. After all, if you are sitting alone on the side of a deserted road in the dark and a large vehicle slowly rolls up next to you, you would naturally look to see who it is. But the girl did not acknowledge them at all. She did not look up. She just continued to keep her knees up to her chest, rocking slowly back and forth. Misty and her mother were a little bit freaked out by this behavior, but they stuck to their plan. They drove past her about 50 yards, and then Misty's mother did another three-point turn. When they turned around and looked back down the road, where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they were oriented back towards their house. But when the headlights swept over the spot, she was not there anymore. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and all they had to light the area were the truck's headlights. Misty told her mom, "Drive up a little ways. Maybe she stood up and moved, and we just cannot see her because she is not in the path of the headlights." And so Misty's mom began driving slowly down the road, turning the truck slightly to the left to shine the headlights more into the trees on that side. But there was no sign of the girl. For good measure, they turned slightly to the right to shine the lights into the woods on the other side of the road, but there was still no sign of her. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the highway, keeping their eyes peeled on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes at about 5 miles per hour and seeing no sign of the girl, they decided that she must have just gone back into the woods and returned to wherever it was she came from. Misty's mom began picking up speed again, relieved to be on their way home. Before long, they had gone about 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen the girl, and they were coming up to a 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. As they were getting close to the intersection, Misty's mother suddenly let out a gasp and slammed on the brakes. There, on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side of the road, was the exact same girl. She was sitting on the side of the road, her back to the highway, her knees pulled up to her chest, slowly rocking back and forth. Misty's mother pulled up to the stop sign and just sat there, the truck idling. Both women were completely stunned by what they were looking at. They had just seen this girl 2 or 3 miles back down the road, It was physically impossible for her to have traveled all the way up here on foot in the time it had taken them to drive. There was no way. Misty's mother looked at her daughter and whispered, "Do you think it is a different girl?" And Misty, shaking with fear, said, "No, Mom. That is the exact same girl." They just sat there in silence for a minute, the terror starting to sink in. Misty began to panic. She turned to her mom and pleaded, "Mom, don't stop. I have a really bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what is going on, but you cannot stop next to her. Just keep driving." But Misty's mom, although she was definitely weirded out by the situation, did not feel good about abandoning a young teenager in the middle of the night on the side of a highway. Even though she felt hesitant herself, she told Misty, "We have to at least drive past her and ask if she is okay. That is the least we can do." Misty was absolutely terrified now. She screamed, "Mom, do not stop! I have a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near her." But her mother let her foot off the brake and began to slow roll past the intersection towards the girl. At this point, Misty was in a state of pure panic. She took her seatbelt off, slid down off the passenger seat, and curled up in the footwell right in front of her seat. She closed her eyes tight, covered her ears with her hands, and continued to beg her mother to please just keep going and not stop. But her mother continued on until she brought the truck to a complete stop right next to the girl, who was still sitting there with her back to the road, her knees up, rocking back and forth. She still was not acknowledging the truck at all. Misty's mother turned to her daughter and said, "Please, roll down your window." But Misty refused. She stayed huddled in the footwell in the fetal position, crying and begging her mother to please just go home. Frustrated and scared, Misty's mother reached across the passenger seat, stretching over Misty, and grabbed the manual window crank. She began rolling the window down. Misty, who was lying in the footwell, remembers sitting there with her eyes closed, crying and covering her ears. She opened her eyes and looked up at her mother, who was leaning over the seat towards the open window. Her mother called out to the girl, asking if she was okay. And then Misty saw her mother suddenly recoil in absolute horror. Her mother let out a blood-curdling scream, threw the truck into drive, and slammed her foot on the gas pedal. They took off like crazy, flying down the dirt road. Misty jumped back up onto the passenger seat, looking at her mother in terror. She screamed, "What is happening?" "What just happened? What did you see?" Her mother had her hand pressed tightly over her mouth. She was speeding down the road, crying, and she was shaking so badly she could barely keep the truck on the road. She looked at Misty, but she seemed to have completely lost the ability to speak. Misty kept asking, "What did you see? What happened?" Finally, her mother managed to whisper, "She didn't have a face, Misty. She didn't have a face. It was just hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me." Misty screamed, and both of them sobbed in terror as they sped the rest of the way home. They arrived at their house a couple of minutes later, running inside and practically falling over each other to lock the door behind them. As soon as they were safe inside, Misty's mom called 911. She did not even know how to describe what they had just seen. She knew it would sound completely crazy to tell the police that they had seen a faceless girl rocking by the highway. So she just told the dispatcher that they had seen a young girl on the side of the road who looked like she needed help. The police went out and searched that entire stretch of the highway, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of anyone ever being out there, and the identity of the rocking girl remains a complete mystery to this day. And then, while some terrifying encounters seem to belong to the realm of the paranormal, others are the result of highly calculated human traps. Fast forward to the year 2018 in the state of Colorado. A 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was going through a very difficult time. He had recently been dumped by his longtime girlfriend, a breakup that had caught him completely by surprise. He had actually just recently moved all the way to Colorado specifically to be closer to her, so he was devastated and felt completely alone in a new place. After a few weeks of being deeply depressed, moping around, and just going through the motions of his daily routine, one of his close friends made a suggestion. He told Derek, hey, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating app? Just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who is out there, and clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one for you. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. Online dating was definitely not something he had ever considered. But he was incredibly lonely and sad, so he figured he had nothing to lose. He made himself a Tinder profile, and very quickly he matched with a woman named Leah. When Derek saw Leah's photos, he was amazed. He thought she was absolutely beautiful, way out of his league, but he certainly was not complaining. They began chatting on the app, and they got on great. They found themselves texting and talking on the phone constantly for a couple of weeks, and they decided they wanted to meet up in person. But the problem was, Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so there was no natural halfway meeting place. They went back and forth trying to figure out where they should go, and finally, Leah said, hey, why don't you just drive down to my town? There is this really great park that I go running in all the time. It has this awesome, massive field on a slope, and you can lay on a blanket and look up through the trees and see all the stars. Stargazing would be a really cool thing for us to do on our first date. Derek thought this sounded perfect. He was excited but also very nervous because this would be the first time they would see each other in person. The plan was for him to drive out to her town and pick her up directly from her workplace. She worked at a local hair salon and she would be finishing up her shift. Derek pulled up to the hair salon right as Leah was coming outside. She looked incredibly excited, waving to him as she ran over and jumped into the passenger seat. They hugged and kissed on the cheek, and Derek felt an instant connection. It was a strange feeling because they had talked so much online, so it felt like they had a history, yet they were still strangers meeting for the first time. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to an access road that was supposed to bring them into the park. But when Leah told him to make the turn onto this road, Derek felt a little uneasy. It did not look like a well-marked trail or an entrance to a public park. It was a narrow, dark dirt road that looked like a random service trail. But he did not know the area, so he trusted her and turned the car down the road. The road quickly turned from paved to rough dirt, and as they drove deeper into the dark, Derek started thinking to himself, did I take a wrong turn? Does she actually know where she is going? This did not feel like the entrance to a big public park. But then, they suddenly landed back on a paved road, and they were driving right next to a massive, beautiful open field. All of Derek's stress evaporated. He realized that even though the access road was weird, they were now in the right place, and everything was fine. Derek asked Leah where he should park. The road was very narrow, and there did not appear to be a parking lot or any other cars around. The field was completely empty and dark. Leah pointed ahead and said, just go right up there. There is a small dirt lot you can pull into. Derek started driving up the road, but as he looked ahead, he saw the dim headlights of another vehicle making its way down the hill towards them. It was dark enough that he could not make out what kind of vehicle it was. Because the road was so narrow, Derek decided to pull over as far to the shoulder as possible to allow the oncoming vehicle to pass them. Even though there was still a fair amount of distance between them, he figured he would just give them the right-of-way. As the vehicle got closer, Derek saw that it was a large, dark van. It was moving very slowly, and Derek just waited for it to pass. He did not think anything of it, assuming it was just another visitor leaving the park. But instead of passing them, the van suddenly turned at the last second. It pulled directly in front of Derek's car, stopping bumper to bumper, completely blocking him in. Derek's police training immediately kicked in. Even though he was a brand new officer, his instincts told him that this was a dangerous situation. Why would a vehicle block him in on a deserted road? Red flags went up instantly. He turned to Leah and said, "Stay here." He reached into the center console, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, jumped out of his car, and marched straight to the driver's side door of the van to confront the driver. When he shone his light inside, he saw a very large man who looked startled to see Derek charging up to his window. Derek tapped on the glass and demanded, "What are you doing, man?" What are you blocking me in for? The big man rolled down the window slightly and said, Oh, hey, sorry about that. I am actually the caretaker here of this whole property. We have had a really big issue with illegal poachers in the area lately, and when I saw your car, I was concerned you guys were poachers. But now that I see you, it is clear you are not. I am really sorry. Derek looked at him, still suspicious, but he replied, No, we are not poachers. We are just here on a date, going stargazing. The caretaker smiled and said, I am so sorry to disturb you. Please, get back in your car and enjoy your night. At that, the man backed up, performed a three-point turn, and drove back up the hill, disappearing over the crest. Derek stood on the road for a couple of minutes to make sure the van was actually gone. Then he turned around, got back into his car, and tried to laugh it off with Leah. He said, Yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a pretty dangerous poacher to him. But when he looked over at Leah, she was not paying attention to him at all. She was staring at her lap, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she furiously typed a message. Derek thought this was a little bit odd. You would think she would be interested in the strange thing that had just happened, or want to know what the man had said. But she did not seem to care at all. She was completely absorbed in her phone. Derek shrugged it off, put the car in drive, and continued up the road. He pulled into the small dirt lot next to the field, turned his car around so it was facing the exit, and parked. He and Leah got out, laid a large blanket on the grass on the hill, and set out their food and wine. Very quickly, they started talking, laughing, and enjoying the night. For the next hour, everything was great. Derek lay on the blanket, looking up at the stars, feeling incredibly relaxed. But then, he noticed something to his left, up at the top of the hill where the van had disappeared. He saw headlights. It was the van again. But this time, it was not driving slowly. It was flying down the hill, accelerating rapidly, heading straight for the dirt lot. Before Derek or Leah could even react, the van roared into the parking lot, kicked up a cloud of dust, and slammed to a stop directly behind Derek's car, completely blocking him in. Derek and Leah jumped up. The driver's side door of the van swung open, and the caretaker hopped out. But this time, he was not acting friendly. He walked around the front of the van, and in his hand, he was carrying a heavy metal pipe. He looked at Derek and growled, "Give me your keys and your wallet right now." Derek, being a young, confident cop, was not about to let this guy rob him. He stood his ground, preparing for a fight. But then, he was hit with a massive curveball. Leah suddenly stepped away from him, ran over to the caretaker, and stood right next to him. She turned to Derek and said, "Come on, Derek. Give us your keys and your wallet." Derek stood there in absolute shock. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The entire date, the weeks of talking, the romantic stargazing spot, it had all been a trap. He had been set up by his date. He felt completely betrayed and sick to his stomach. As he stood there in silence, Leah walked to the back of the van, opened the doors, and pulled out another heavy metal pipe. She walked back to the front and said, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We do not want to have to hurt you." Derek looked at the two of them, took a deep breath, and said, "No." The moment he said it, the big man lunged forward and tackled Derek to the ground. But Derek was a trained police officer, and he knew how to defend himself. He quickly overpowered the larger man, pushed him off, and scrambled back to his feet. He reached into his waistband, drew his concealed carry pistol, and pointed it directly at the big man, then quickly swept it toward Leah. He yelled, "I am a police officer! Get your hands up right now!" The moment they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and raised their hands, their faces filled with shock. Derek kept his weapon trained on them, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had to keep them at gunpoint while trying to call 911 on his phone. He dialed the number, and when the dispatcher answered, he tried to explain his situation and where he was. But because he was in a remote park in a town he did not know well, giving directions was incredibly difficult. As he was trying to explain to the dispatcher how to get to the lot, Leah and the caretaker looked at each other. Realizing his attention was split, they suddenly turned and bolted, running behind the van and sprinting into the dark woods. Instinctively, Derek took off running after them. He chased them into the tree line, but he had only been in the woods for about 30 seconds when he heard a sudden, loud sound. It was a gunshot. And then another. He saw the bright muzzle flashes coming from the darkness ahead of him. Someone in the woods was shooting at him. Derek realized he was completely exposed and had no cover, so he turned around and ran as fast as he could back to his car. He jumped inside, started the engine, and had to perform a frantic, desperate multi-point turn, smashing his car's rear bumper into the van and scraping against the fence over and over again before he was finally able to clear the obstacle and speed out of the parking lot. He drove as fast as he could down the road until he reached a brightly lit gas station. He called dispatch back, explained that he was safe, and asked them to send officers to his location. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled into the gas station. 2 senior officers got out, and Derek explained the entire story to them. They were shocked by what had happened, and they decided they would all drive back up to the park together to investigate. When they arrived at the dirt lot, they saw the van was still parked there, completely empty. The 2 senior officers drew their weapons and carefully approached the vehicle while Derek stayed back. They searched the area, confirmed no one was around, and then began shining their flashlights inside the van. After a few minutes, they walked back to the cruiser. Derek could tell by the serious, pale looks on their faces that something was very wrong. One of the officers looked at him and said, "Derek, you are incredibly lucky to be alive. The back of that van is filled with knives, handsaws, pistols, rifles, bottles of lighter fluid, chains, handcuffs, and rolls of duct tape. And there are fresh bloodstains on the floor." The police launched a massive investigation. They went to the hair salon the next morning and spoke to the owner, showing them the photos of Leah. But the owner shook her head and said, "We have never had anyone named Leah work here, and we have never seen this girl in our lives." The entire thing had been a carefully planned, elaborate setup. The profile was fake, her job was a lie, and the romantic date was nothing more than a trap to lure him to a place where they could rob, torture, or murder him. The suspects were never identified or caught, and Derek deleted Tinder immediately, haunted by the realization of how close he had come to ending up in the back of that van. And so, while some predators use the promise of romance to lure their victims, others walk the crowded city streets, driven by dark impulses that they claim they cannot control, leaving a trail of grief behind them. This brings us to the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, in the winter of 1980. On New Year's Eve, the streets were filled with people celebrating the holiday. Among them was 20-year-old Karen Potak. She had been out at a bar with her friends, laughing and drinking, but as the night wore on, she decided she wanted to go home. She slipped out of the bar without telling her friends, stepping into the freezing cold night. The problem was, she had left her heavy winter coat inside. Shivering violently in her light dress, she began stumbling down the dark, icy streets, trying to find her way home. As she was walking, a car pulled up next to her. The driver, a polite-sounding man, offered to give her a ride home. Karen was cold, tired, and under the influence of alcohol, so she gratefully accepted and got into the passenger seat. A few hours later, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, the emergency police dispatcher received a telephone call. The caller's voice was frantic, high-pitched, and filled with tears. He sobbed into the receiver, "Please, this is an emergency. Send a squad to Pierce Butler Road near the Menberg Manufacturing Company machine shop. Send an ambulance too. There is a girl there." The dispatcher asked, "Can you tell me what happened to her?" The caller cried, "Just hurry! She is laying on the ground, in the back, by the railroad tracks." The dispatcher asked, "What is the address?" The man sobbed, "I don't know," and immediately hung up the phone. The police rushed to the industrial area behind the manufacturing building, and there, lying on the frozen ground in a pool of blood, they found Karen Potak. She had been brutally beaten over the head with a heavy tire iron and left to die in the freezing cold. Miraculously, she was still breathing. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors managed to save her life. But because of the severe head trauma she suffered, Karen had complete amnesia. She could not remember anything about the attack, the car, or the man who had picked her up. The police searched the area, but because of a fresh snowfall and the desolate location, there was no physical evidence. The case quickly went cold. Then, 5 months later, in May of 1981, the police received another chilling phone call. The dispatcher answered, and a weeping, emotional voice came through the line. The man was crying uncontrollably, saying, "Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." The police did not connect this brief call to the attack on Karen Potak, and because the caller did not give a location, they did not know where to send help. But a few hours later, a group of teenagers walking through a wooded area near a highway in St. Paul found the dead body of 18-year-old Kimberly Compton. Kimberly had just arrived in the Twin Cities that very day, wanting to start a fresh, independent life. She had gotten off the bus, walked into a nearby diner, and was sitting alone when a friendly man approached her and asked to sit with her. When she told him she was new to the city, the man offered to drive her around and show her the sights. Kimberly accepted. Within 15 minutes of getting into his car, the man drove her to a secluded wooded area and stabbed her to death with an ice pick. 2 days after her body was found, the weepy-voiced killer called the police again, crying and confessing to the murder. He said he was sorry, that he did not know why he had to stab her, and that he would rather kill himself than go to prison. The police now knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but they had almost no clues. The diner staff could only provide a very general description of the man she had been sitting with, which could have fit anyone. The case went cold once again. 6 months later, in November of 1981, the phone at the police station rang again. The crying voice said, "Please don't talk, just listen. I am sorry. I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one, but I don't know what is wrong with me. I am sick." The next day, a search crew found the body of 40-year-old Barbara Simons floating in the Mississippi River. She had been stabbed to death. The police discovered that on the night of her murder, she had been out at a local bar chatting and flirting with a man. Before leaving with him, she had jokingly told a waitress, "Boy, I hope he is nice because I am leaving with him." The waitress had a bad feeling about the man, so she made a conscious effort to get a really good look at his face. This intuition proved to be the break the police needed. When detectives interviewed the waitress, she gave them a detailed description, and when shown a book of mugshots, she immediately pointed to 38-year-old Paul Stefani. The police put Stefani under surveillance, but within 24 hours he managed to lose them. He drove into downtown Minneapolis, where he picked up 19-year-old Denise Williams. He took her down a dark alleyway where Denise sensed danger. When Paul pulled out an ice pick and lunged at her, Denise grabbed a glass bottle from the floor and smashed it over his head, cutting him deeply. She managed to escape and run for help, and a neighbor called 911. Paul fled the scene, bleeding heavily. Later that night, the weepy-voiced killer called for an ambulance, sobbing that he was badly cut up and bleeding from his head and arms. The dispatcher instantly recognized the high-pitched crying voice from the public recordings and sent both paramedics and police to the apartment. Paul Stefani was arrested in his hospital bed. He was convicted of the murder of Barbara Simons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams and sentenced to 58 years in prison. For 12 years, he maintained his innocence. But in 1997, after being diagnosed with terminal skin cancer, he decided to confess to all of his crimes. He admitted to the murders of Kimberly Compton and Barbara Simons, the attacks on Karen Potak and Denise Williams, and another unsolved murder, 33-year-old Kathleen Greening, who had been found drowned in her bathtub. He died of cancer shortly after, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and unanswered questions for the families of his victims. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 12th of August 2000, a huge fleet of 33 of Russia's most advanced naval warships gathered in a specific part of the Barents Sea. This sea is a massive 800-mile stretch of freezing, unforgiving water in the Arctic Circle, just northwest of Russia. These 33 ships weren't there by accident. They were there for a massive military training exercise. The plan was to run through a series of war game scenarios. For example, one ship would play the role of an enemy, and the other ships would practice locking onto it with their targeting systems and firing at it. But of course, they weren't using live ammunition. They were using dummy torpedoes and missiles, the kind that don't actually explode. Around 9 in the morning, the man in charge of this entire operation, Admiral Popov, gave the first command. He was on board one of the 33 ships overseeing everything. He authorized one of the submarines out there to shoot 2 of its dummy torpedoes at a designated target. The target was just one of the other ships pretending to be the enemy. As soon as he gave that order, the multi-day exercise officially began. All day and all through the night, these ships ran their drills, simulating combat and testing their systems. By the next morning, a full 24 hours into the exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action for a bit. He had a scheduled call with some Russian reporters. During this interview, he told them that so far, the training exercise was going exactly to plan. He painted a picture of success, saying that it looked like it was going to be a huge achievement for the Russian Navy. But there was a problem. At the very same time that Admiral Popov was on the phone telling reporters how well everything was going, a rumor started to spread among the families of the crewmen who were out on the Barents Sea. The rumor was that the exercise was not going to plan at all. In fact, the word was that something terrible had happened to one of the ships. None of the family members had any concrete information. It was just a whisper, a feeling of dread that was passed from one person to another. But even though it was just a rumor, it was enough to cause serious worry. That morning, families began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had departed from, desperate for any information. At first, the phone operator at the base who was taking all these calls stuck to the official story. She told the frantic family members that no, nothing was wrong. She hadn't heard anything about any issues. But as the calls kept flooding in, the operator eventually let something slip. She admitted that she had also heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and she thought it might actually be true. One of the family members on the line heard this and immediately pressed the operator for more details. But at that point, the operator clammed up. She said she couldn't give out any more information and ended the conversation. So, the family member hung up the phone and did the next logical thing. They called the media. They told the reporters what was going on, about the rumor, and the operator's strange admission. As soon as the media had this story, they went straight back to Admiral Popov. They asked him directly if he could address the rumor, but he didn't. He gave no response to any of their questions. In a strange way, his silence was a little reassuring to some of the families. They figured that if Admiral Popov was just ignoring the rumor and staying out there on the Barents Sea, continuing with the exercise, then surely nothing truly bad could have happened. So, for the rest of that day, which was a Sunday, the families and the media just waited. There wasn't much else they could do. They had to wait for new information to come out of the exercise. The next day, on Monday, the 14th, 48 hours after the training had started, there was finally news. Russian officials went on television to formally address the rumor. And they said, yes, it was true. Something had happened during the exercise. They explained that the Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines participating in the drill, had experienced some minor technical difficulties. They said these difficulties had forced the submarine to ground itself on the bottom of the Barents Sea. But they quickly added that everyone should remain calm. This was a normal procedure, they said. They were in radio contact with the crew, everybody was fine, and they were already pumping air and power into the submarine. They assured the public that before long, they would have the Kursk back on the surface. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. Naturally, the family members of the Kursk's crew panicked when they heard this. Even though the government officials sounded completely confident, the families did not feel confident at all. Their loved ones were trapped at the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they tried to hold on to a glimmer of hope. They remembered that the Kursk was not just any submarine. It was a very special and supposedly very safe vessel. The Kursk was, quite literally, Russia's best ship. No expense had been spared in its construction. It was incredibly expensive and absolutely massive, bigger than 2 football fields put together. It was built out of a specialized, highly reinforced steel that was designed to allow it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep going without any major problems. The inside was also outfitted with all the latest and greatest technology. So, the thinking was, if you had to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside the Kursk. And the families took some small comfort in that. But over the next couple of days, that comfort began to fade. Despite the government's constant reassurances in the news that everything was fine, that it was a minor issue, and that they'd have the Kursk up in no time, the submarine was still at the bottom of the sea. And the government wasn't giving the families or the media any new information. In this vacuum of information, the families began to panic again, and the media started to speculate. Did the Kursk really just suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something much, much more serious? That question would be answered on August 21st, 9 days after the training exercise had begun. A Norwegian dive team had been brought in to assist with the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk's location. They managed to get inside the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like a small, watertight closet on the outside of the sub that allows people to enter and exit without flooding the interior. Once these Norwegian divers got inside the Kursk and had a look around, they were completely shocked by what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated to this day, and probably will be for a long time, there is one part of the story that is more or less universally accepted. And that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 separate watertight segments called compartments. Compartment 1 was at the very front of the submarine, and they were numbered sequentially all the way to compartment 9 at the very back. The reason we know what happened inside compartment 9 is because a 27-year-old crew member named Dmitry Kolesnikov told us Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his grandfather was a submariner. Growing up, Dmitry idolized them, and all he ever wanted to do was follow in their footsteps. In the late 1990s, his dream came true. He was commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve aboard the Kursk. Just 4 months before this fateful training exercise, Dmitry met and quickly married a high school teacher named Olga. Right after their wedding, one of the first things he did was bring her on board the Kursk for a personal tour. Olga brought a video camera with her and filmed the entire tour. On that video, Dmitry is all smiles. He's so happy leading her around the ship, introducing her to his crewmates, and showing her all the cramped spaces on board. It's incredibly obvious from the video that Dmitry was so proud of his job, and even more proud to be sharing that part of his life with his new wife. Fast forward to the 12th of August 2000. Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members, had just arrived at their designated location in the Barents Sea for the exercise. At 11:27 inches the morning, the captain of the Kursk came over the radio. He spoke to Admiral Popov, who was on a separate ship. The captain informed the admiral that the Kursk was about to fire its 2 dummy torpedoes. After that call was made, the crewmen in the first compartment of the Kursk, at the very front of the sub where the torpedoes were stored, began loading the two dummies into the tubes. Meanwhile, Dmitri was all the way back in the seventh compartment. This was the engine room, and it was where he was stationed. In fact, he was the officer in charge of everyone who worked in compartment 7. So, as the two dummy torpedoes were being loaded up front, Dmitri and his men were at their posts, twisting dials and pulling levers, running through their checks. All of a sudden, there was a really loud crashing sound. Then the entire ship shuddered violently and jolted hard to one side, as if a giant hand had grabbed the front of the submarine and twisted it. What Dmitri and the men in the seventh compartment couldn't possibly have known was that one of the real live torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned, and it had just exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong its reinforced hull was, the torpedo explosion, just as advertised, did not puncture through the outer wall. It did cause a lot of damage and started a massive fire, but the sub was not yet sinking. Back in the seventh compartment, Dmitri picked himself up from the floor. Alarms were blaring, and everything was total chaos. Everyone was shouting, asking what was going on. Dmitri took charge. He ordered his men to follow their emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of their compartment. In this case, he sealed the door leading to the sixth compartment in front of them and the door leading to the eighth compartment behind them. There are a lot of reasons for this protocol, but the main one is to contain damage. If there's a leak somewhere else on the submarine, sealing off your compartment protects you from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men were turning the heavy wheels to seal the two doors, they would have started to see and smell smoke pouring in through the ventilation ducts. This smoke was coming from the uncontrolled fire that was now raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle. The captain of the Kursk was desperately trying to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off an almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast was catastrophic. It killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or they died moments later when the hull was finally breached. This second explosion was so powerful that it did puncture the walls of the sub, creating a huge hole in the front. Icy Arctic water began flooding in at an incredible rate. So if you weren't killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were those in the sixth compartment and further back. So compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9. Dmitri and the other men in the seventh compartment would have been badly shaken up by that second explosion. It would have rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they were still alive, and they were very aware of the terrible situation they were in. I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any piping or equipment they could as the submarine, its control room now destroyed, just angled straight down and began to plummet towards the ocean floor. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the seabed 350 feet below the surface. And then the back half of the submarine settled down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for the first 2 hours after it hit the bottom. What we do know is that they had power. So there was light inside the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite all the chemicals and smoke in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. We also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the sixth compartment. Remember, they had sealed off the doors to both the eighth and the sixth compartments. Hearing the banging, Dmitri made a decision. He decided to break emergency protocol. he opened the door to the sixth compartment to allow any survivors who were banging on it to come into their section. When Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the sixth compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding. It was also clear that most likely anybody forward of that compartment in 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1 was already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the seventh compartment, along with the other survivors from the sixth, were forced to retreat. They moved from the seventh compartment into the eighth, and then finally into the ninth compartment at the very back of the submarine. The flooding was getting worse. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls themselves were no longer watertight. The huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all the walls between the compartments. So it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment filled up, the water would begin leaking through all the cracks and holes in the walls. Dmitri and all the men with him would have been very aware of this. By the time they all got back to the ninth compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them. They were doomed, unless they were rescued or unless they could get out through the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper. As he's sitting there in this cramped ninth compartment with 22 other men, he writes the date and the time in the corner. Then he begins to describe what had happened. He writes about an explosion and that he thought he and these 22 other men were the only survivors. He says they are now trapped in the ninth compartment and they have to wait for rescue. He also mentions that they had considered using the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, and very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket. Then, for the next hour and a half, he sat there inside the ninth compartment with the 22 others. And then, the power went out. This plunged them into absolute pitch-black darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there. And because the power was out, the temperatures suddenly began to plummet. Then, the worst part, the water began seeping through the walls much faster. Dmitri and the other men would have known then that it was just a matter of time before the room filled completely with water. And there was nowhere to go. So, with the water rising all around them in the dark, Dmitri pulled that piece of paper back out of his pocket, and he added to the note, but this time his handwriting is barely legible. It's because he was probably suffering from hypothermia, so he would have been shaking uncontrollably. He also couldn't see what he was writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate that it's totally dark in the room. In this second part of the note, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear that none of them think they're going to make it. Then, with the remaining space on the piece of paper, Dmitri writes a very loving and thoughtful message to his wife and his family, saying goodbye. And then his final words on the note are, "Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message, he folded the paper up, put it back in his breast pocket, and then, in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know exactly how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9. But experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded about 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this whole story is that Dmitri and those 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response had been a little more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of the other ships in the exercise, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second massive explosion from the Kursk, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really took any action. And then, when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire their dummy torpedoes, everyone just assumed it was a radio problem. They figured the Kursk was fine and would be in touch soon. So it wasn't until later that evening that the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem, that the Kursk had effectively vanished. And then it would be several more hours before they even got a rescue submersible into the water and down to the Kursk's location. Once it was down there, the Russian rescue sub could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. So even if there were survivors inside, they would not have been able to get out. For days, the Russians struggled to get inside the submarine and kept turning down offers of foreign aid from Norway, from America, and from Great Britain. Then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sunk, the Russians accepted foreign aid. That's when the Norwegian dive team went down. They were able to open up the escape hatch relatively quickly. When they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when, ultimately, Dimitri's body was found. And they found that note tucked safely in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. The families of the crew were each given 10 years' salary. They were also given free housing in any Russian city of their choice, and their children would all have their college educations paid for. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A relaxed pace of life may be found in the little town of Osborne, Idaho, in the state of Idaho. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else, and the routine of daily life is determined by the gentle rhythm of the changing of the seasons. A thick covering of immaculate white snow encompasses the area during the winter months, transforming the rocky hills and dense forests into a world that is silent and frozen during this time of year. Dylan Parker, who was 18 years old at the time, was negotiating the final stretch of his teenage years in this particular context. The majority of the time, Dylan was a typical child. He was in the process of determining what he wanted to do with his life after graduating from high school. He had a strong bond with his family, particularly with his mother, and he had a nice group of friends from his younger years. He, like many other adolescents, had pleasure in interacting with others, and on the evening of the 12th of January 2016, he found himself at a party with a few of his close companions for the first time. A home in his hometown was the location of the party that was being held. A continuous snowfall had been dusting the town for hours, adding to the already thick snowpack that was on the ground. It was a cold night during which the snowstorm had been occurring. At the interior, there was a friendly and energetic environment. Dylan was having a nice time, and there was music playing, people were talking and laughing, and things were going well. A couple drinks were consumed by him as the night progressed. As the hours went by, Dylan made the decision that it was almost time for him to leave the party and go home. This was not something that was out of the norm for a party like this. The effects of the alcohol were beginning to take hold of him, and the prospect of returning to the warmth and comfort of his own bed felt like a very good idea. It was the weather that was the issue. Considering that it was still snowing and that it was chilly, walking home was not a very good alternative. Therefore, he did what any other child in his position might have done. After pulling out his phone, he dialed his mother's number. As soon as his mother answered the phone, she was able to determine without a doubt that Dylan had been drinking. There was a slight slur in his voice, and his words were slurred. She felt the usual mixture of parental emotions, a little amount of disappointment, a touch of aggravation that he was drinking at a young age, but the thing that made her feel the most concerned was a profound sense of protectiveness over him. It was late, the weather was terrible, and all she truly needed was to know that her son was safe and sound while he was staying at home. It would be possible for them to discuss his decisions in the morning. Consequently, she listened attentively when he inquired about the possibility of her coming to pick him up. It was he who informed her that he was at a party and that he would stroll down the road to a gas station in the vicinity in order to meet her. It was a well-known location that was simple to locate. There was no uncertainty in her agreement. She informed him that she was on her way and that he should wait for her at the location she was going to be. Immediately following the conclusion of the call, Dylan's mother retrieved her keys and her coat before departing into the chilly night. As the snow continued to fall, the roads became difficult to navigate and visibility was somewhat diminished. While she was driving, she kept her mind focused on her son. Although she was imagining the lecture that she was going to deliver to him the next day, the primary objective at the moment was to just get him into the car and drive him back to the house. It was possible that she was only a few minutes away from the petrol station when her phone called once again as she was driving. Dylan was the one. On the other hand, the manner in which he spoke was entirely different this time. A comfortable and intoxicated slur was no longer present. She felt a bolt of alarm run through her body as a result of the sharp, anxious edge that had replaced it. Fear was audible in his voice. When he inquired, "Where are you?" "Where are you, Mom?" His voice was strained and frantic. "Where are you?" She attempted to reassure him that everything would be fine by assuring him that she was almost there, that she would be there in a minute or two, and that she was almost there. They were only a short distance away. However, the call was cut off suddenly. He just ended the call. It was 1 minute later when she pulled into the petrol station, which was illuminated by strong fluorescent lights. As she examined the surroundings, she anticipated seeing Dylan waiting for her, possibly stamping his feet to increase his body temperature. The snow was swirling around her car as she did so. However, he was not present. During the few minutes that she waited in the car, she entertained the thought that perhaps he was just walking down the road and was running a little bit behind schedule. However, the minutes continued to pass, and there was still no indication that he was present. She started to feel a knot of worry tightening up in her stomach. She attempted to call his phone, but the call was immediately transferred to his voicemail. That was a peculiar occurrence. Not long ago, he had called her. Why is his phone turned off at this moment? After getting out of her vehicle, she proceeded to stroll into the gas station. She inquired with the person working behind the counter as to whether or not they seen a young man who matched the description of her son. There was a head shake from the cashier. There had been no one else in the room like that. At this point, genuine fear was beginning to take hold. She got back into her vehicle and started driving around the neighborhood in the immediate vicinity. As she drove between the gas station and the house where the party had been held, she went up and down the road 3 times. She cried his name into the snowy night as she rolled down the window, allowing the chilly air to rush in. The night was silent around her. However, the only reaction that could be heard was the gentle hiss of the snow falling. "Dylan! Dylan!" Approximately 30 minutes passed while she was driving around, and her heart was beating rapidly with each passing moment. She continued to call his phone over and over again, but each and every time, the call was disconnected and sent to his voicemail. The situation was not right. This was not typical of him. That frantic phone call kept playing over and over in her head. Something had transpired in his life during the brief interval of time that elapsed between the initial call he made to her and the subsequent call he made to her. She was absolutely confident that she required assistance, and the realization gave her a chill down to her bones. She halted her vehicle, her hands shaking, and then she dialed the number for the police. The data were taken down by the police from Dylan's mother, who was in a state of panic when they arrived. The young man, who was 18 years old, went to a party, had a few drinks, and then called for a ride, and now he is missing. In a circumstance such as this one, the first notion that comes to mind is frequently that the individual is not in any real danger. Perhaps he became disoriented as a result of the booze and made the decision to stroll to the residence of a different acquaintance. Perhaps his phone had a malfunction, and he had to find a place to rest for the night nonetheless. However, there was not an immediate feeling of a significant crisis, despite the fact that the police had informed his mother that they would seek for him. Once they arrived, their first destination was the residence where the party had been held. They entered the building and immediately began conversing with the children who were still present. Specifically, they inquired about Dylan. What was the most recent time that they visited him? What kind of temper did he have? Is he going to tell you where he is going? Every single one of the responses was similar. Everyone remarked that Dylan appeared to be in good health. His disposition was upbeat, and he was simply hanging out with the other people. Towards the end of the night, he merely stated that his mother was on her way to pick him up at the gas station. After that, he said his goodbyes and went out of the door. Nobody seen him getting into a car with anyone else. Nobody overheard any arguments, and nobody witnessed anything out of the ordinary. Just now, he left. According to their point of view, the evening came to a conclusion that was entirely typical. After expressing their gratitude, the law enforcement officers returned to the outdoors. The search of the area was initiated by them. The route that led from the party home to the gas station was investigated by them. Their flashlights were able to cut through the pouring snow as they searched in ditches and behind buildings. And still, they discovered nothing. There is no trace of Dylan. They did not find any discarded jackets or footprints that they could positively identify as belonging to him. While the hours went into days, the search for Dylan Parker became more and more intensified. As time went by, the initial hypothesis that he had simply wandered out and would return with a slight hangover began to lose its validity, and it was gradually replaced with a rising concern for his well-being. A bigger number of search parties were formed by the local police enforcement. Many others, including friends, relatives, and members of the community, came out to lend a hand, dressed in heavy clothing, to protect themselves from the bitter cold of the Idaho winter. Across the entirety of Osborne, they dispersed themselves and searched in fields, neighborhoods, and wooded regions. They concentrated on the path that he ought to have followed, which was from the party house to the gas station, and then expanded their search grid in a more general direction from there. However, the snow proved a significant hindrance. Because of the severe snowstorm that occurred on the night that he vanished, any possible trails or evidence had been covered up, and the environment remained frozen solid due to the cold temperatures. It was like trying to find a needle in a huge haystack that was completely white. The family of Dylan found themselves in a state of suspended pain for a period of 10 agonizing days. They jumped with excitement at every phone call, hoping that there was some kind of news. Every time someone knocked on the door, a new wave of anxiousness was triggered. The flyers for the missing person were distributed across the entire town, with the image of Dylan's happy smile appearing on community notice boards and telephone poles. The town of Osborne came together in support of them, but in spite of all the efforts that were made, there was unquestionably nothing. At that moment, it appeared as though Dylan Parker had simply disappeared into the chilly winter air. The police had no leads to follow. Even though they had investigated his phone records, the most recent action that had occurred was that frantic call to his mother. Immediately after that, the phone was either turned off or the battery died in some way. The digital trace could not be followed in any way. After 10 days had passed since Dylan had vanished, the investigation suddenly took a tragic and unexpected turn. Police officers or search teams were not the ones who made the find. It was a complete and utter coincidence. It was a desolate region outside of town where two people were out riding their all-terrain vehicles, ATVs. As they navigated the treacherous and icy terrain, they were having a good time when they experienced a collision. Although it was not a serious incident, they made the decision to leave their damaged ATVs there and come back for them in the morning. This was because it was late in the evening. They went back to the location the following day when the sun was shining brightly in order to return and reclaim their automobiles. And at that moment, they came across something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a body that was lying in a dense stretch of forest high up on a hill, partially covered in snow. As soon as they could, they contacted the authorities. It was determined that Dylan Parker was the deceased individual when the police arrived and recognized the body. The worst concerns that his family had had just come true. As the initial wave of shock and grief went over everyone, however, the detectives who were present at the site started to discover that something was extremely wrong. The very location was the first significant warning sign that was raised. It was a long way from where anyone had been looking when Dylan was discovered. In order for him to arrive to this location, he would have needed to walk in the opposite direction of the petrol station where he was meant to meet his mother. The petrol station was located in the middle of the town, close to the roadways, the lights, and the heart of the community. Away from all of that was the location where he was discovered. It would have been necessary for him to walk uphill, away from the town, and into the woods where it would have been dark. In no way did it make any sense at all. The presence of alcohol in Dylan's system would eventually be confirmed by a toxicology study, despite the fact that he was actually in his hometown. He was so familiar with the region that he could walk into it. In spite of the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol, it seems highly improbable that he would become so bewildered that he would walk for kilometers in the wrong way, uphill and into a tough environment that was covered in trees. By heading in the direction of the gas station, one was walking in the direction of civilization. There would have been a clear beacon in the form of the lights of the town. If you walked in the opposite direction, you would be entering a completely dark wilderness. There was a major disparity between the two routes. Why would he choose the path that would take him away from his ride home and away from the potential for danger? On the other hand, that was only the beginning of the peculiar and unsettling riddle that the detectives were currently looking into. In and of itself, the scene exhibited a number of physical inconsistencies that prevented any straightforward explanation from being possible. The snow was the component that was the most perplexing. The night that Dylan went missing, there was already a considerable amount of snow on the ground, and it continued to snow throughout the night. Dylan was in the process of going missing. There was no snowfall for the 10 days that followed, which was the time period until his body was discovered. The temperatures remained constantly below freezing, which meant that none of the snow that was already present had melted. This was an extremely important fact. A flawless and unaltered record of the ground was produced as a result of this. A clear set of tracks would have been left behind by any person or vehicle that moved through that region, and those tracks would have been preserved in the frozen snow. An exhaustive search of the entire area surrounding Dylan's body was carried out by the detectives after his body was reported missing. Footprints, tire marks, and any other indication of how he arrived were among the things that they were looking for. It was a complete failure. There were no traces that led to the body of the deceased. It was impossible to find any tracks that led away from the body. It was impossible to find any form of footsteps, not only his, but also those of anyone else. Neither an automobile nor an all-terrain vehicle left any tire tracks here. The snow that was all around him was unbroken and as smooth as silk. It appeared as though he had been meticulously positioned there from above, as if he had tumbled down from the heavens into that particular location. This revelation was the single most important factor in disproving the idea that he had strayed off and became disoriented. In the event that he had walked there, there would have been a lengthy and distinct path of his own footsteps flowing up the hill and into the woodland underneath. Neither of these trails existed. Without a doubt, it was physically impossible. Given this information, it was likely that he had been brought to that area by means of another method. If so, how? In this case, a vehicle would have left tracks. There would have been a clear path left behind, even by a snowmobile. In contrast, there was nothing. Simply by virtue of this circumstance, the investigation was transformed from a possible accident into a death that was subject to intense suspicion. As the detectives continued their search, the more peculiar these circumstances appeared. Dylan was discovered without his pants and without his boots, which was yet another piece of information that was really unsettling about the scene. However, his lower body was exposed to the elements, despite the fact that he was wearing a shirt and socks. The fact that hypothermia was stated as the official cause of death for the individual in question was a peculiar occurrence overall. Despite the fact that it is true that a person might experience a phenomena known as paradoxical undressing in the final stages of freezing to death, in which they begin to feel hot and begin to remove their garments, the fact that those clothes were completely absent from the scene was extremely suspicious. His pants and boots ought to have been laying right there next to him, or at least someplace in the immediate neighborhood, if he had removed them on his own while he was in a state of confusion. There was a thorough and extensive search of the region that was carried out. A grid was constructed by dozens of law enforcement authorities and search and rescue teams on the hillside and in the woodland surrounding the location where Dylan was discovered. They searched every inch of the area. A combination of metal detectors and K9 units that had been specifically trained to locate pieces of clothing and human scent were utilized by the team. They looked on for several days. His pants were never located by them. His boots were never located by them. All of the goods had simply vanished. The fact that he did not remove them himself at that location was strongly implied by this revelation. It suggested that they were removed and taken away from the scene by a different individual, maybe with the intention of removing any potential evidence that might have been present. The condition of Dylan's feet, on the other hand, was perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence that pointed away from the accident theory. Upon his discovery, he was only wearing socks. It would be necessary for a person to go through a difficult, snowy, and rocky forest in order to reach that remote location that is located high on a hill. If someone were to attempt that voyage without wearing boots, they would undoubtedly get multiple injuries. They would suffer cuts, scrapes, and bruises on their feet as a result of the pebbles and branches that were concealed behind the snow. This would result in their socks being ripped to shreds and covered in mud, snow, and grime. This is nothing more than basic physics and common sense. When the body of Dylan was investigated by the detectives, they were astounded to discover that his socks were spotless. There was no evidence of them being damp, unclean, or ripped. And when the feet were examined by the coroner, it was discovered that they were absolutely free of any injuries. Everything that would have indicated that he had traveled even a short distance over that kind of terrain was completely absent, including cuts, bruises, scratches, and other marks. As a result of this particular piece of information, the official story was entirely discredited. The task was not feasible. There is no way that he could have done that by foot. The absence of footprints in the snow that was completely untouched, the fact that his pants and boots were absent, and the fact that his feet and socks were clean and unharmed, all contributed to the creation of a disturbing picture. There was no evidence that Dylan Parker made his way into the woods and died of hypothermia. That is where he was brought. The circumstance had been fabricated. This somebody had either transported him or drove him to that spot via an unidentified method that did not leave any traces behind, removed some of his clothing, and then left his body there for others to discover there. The event in question was not a terrible accident, rather it was something much more diabolical. Behind the scenes, a huge disagreement started to develop as the official investigation moved forward toward its conclusion. The official cause of death was ruled to be hypothermia according to its finding. On the basis of this information, the local authorities and the county were getting ready to conclude the case and declare Dylan's death to be the result of an undesirable accident. The story that they were constructing was that he had been drinking, that he had become disoriented in the snowstorm, that he had strayed in the wrong direction, and that he had ultimately passed away due to the frigid conditions. Although they accepted the peculiar features, they appeared determined to disregard them as anomalies that might be explained, possibly due to the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol. Nevertheless, this straightforward explanation was not accepted by all individuals. An individual by the name of David Roos, who served as the deputy coroner, was one of the important figures who disagreed. Roos had been present at the location. After examining Dylan's body, he had left. In addition, he was the kind of person who put the utmost faith in reasoning and evidence. It was very clear to him that this was not anything that could have happened by chance. Among the anomalies that were not insignificant were the pristine snow that did not have any tracks, the missing clothing that were never located, and most importantly, the spotless socks and feet that were not wounded. They were evident inconsistencies with the theory that the disaster occurred. He was certain that Dylan had been the victim of some kind of criminal activity. He was under the impression that Dylan had been attacked or killed after leaving that party, and that his body had been transported sometime later to that hillside in order to deceive authorities. He suspected that something had occurred to Dylan after he left that party. His professional view was that the scene was a planned performance. David Roos became somewhat outspoken in his expression of his worries. His findings were reported to his superiors, and he urged that the case ought to be treated as a possible homicide. He also had conversations with the investigators who were leading the investigation. He was of the opinion that it would be a grave injustice to Dylan and his family to just assume that it was an accident. That whoever was genuinely responsible for his death would be able to get away with it was the implication of this. However, his arguments were not taken seriously by anyone. Those in charge of the local government were resolute in their conclusion. In a public announcement, they stated that Dylan Parker's death was the result of an accident and that there was no evidence to suggest that he was murdered. They were formally putting an end to the investigation. David Roos was utterly appalled by this decision. His impression was that the authorities were disregarding physical evidence that could not be refuted. Instead of letting it go, he made the decision to voice his concerns to the general public. In his statement to the media, he detailed the various contradictions that were present at the site and expressed his unwavering conviction that Dylan had been the victim of an assault. He anticipated that by drawing the attention of the public to the issue, he would be able to exert pressure on the county to restart the inquiry and take a serious look at the potential of homicide. In his defense of what he considered to be the truth, he was fighting. However, the response that he received from the county was not what he had hoped for. In lieu of conducting a fresh investigation into the matter, they focused their attention on him. David Roos was terminated from his post as deputy coroner by the county shortly after he made his disagreement with the current administration public. In their formal explanation, they stated that he was no longer qualified to perform the duties of the position. Roos, on the other hand, was persuaded that he was terminated for one purpose and one reason only: to keep him hidden from the public. He was under the impression that the county was trying to cover up the case in order to avoid the hassles and potential scandal that would arise from a homicide inquiry. He was a thorn in their side. Not only did they remove his official platform by sacking him, but they also made it abundantly apparent that they would not allow any type of opposition. Therefore, the official version of events was correct. It was determined that Dylan Parker's passing was by accident. This case has been resolved. However, there was never any more investigation carried out. Never once was anyone questioned about the likelihood of a criminal act being committed. It was never attempted to identify the person or individuals who were most likely responsible for Dylan's passing. Dylan's family was placed in an unfavorable circumstance as a result of the consequences of this decision. The pain that they were left with was compounded by a terrible sense of injustice, and they were completely unable to find any answers to their questions. They were given an official explanation for their son's death that was completely illogical and contradicted all of the evidence. They had a familiarity with both their son and the community. It was unfathomable to think that he would become so disoriented that he would walk in the opposite direction of his ride home, uphill into a dark forest, and that he would accomplish this without leaving a single footprint. Although it was terrifying to think about, the idea that was proposed by the coroner, David Roos, was the only one that appeared to be consistent with the peculiar and unsettling facts. The absence of traces, the absence of garments, and the pristine condition of his feet could all be accounted for by this one explanation alone. The question is, what exactly took place with Dylan Parker on that chilly night in January? We are able to attempt to rebuild a series of events that is more credible despite the fact that it is scary based on the data. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, Dylan left the party with the intention of walking the short distance to the petrol station. During the course of that little stroll, he came across something or someone. It was possible that it was a person he knew, but it could also have been a complete stranger. A ride might have been provided to him by them. When he called his mother for the first time, he was calm. Simply put, he was validating the action plan. However, within the few minutes that followed, a terrible occurrence occurred regarding the situation. The second phone call, the one in which he sounded terrified and worried, was most likely made while this horrific new circumstance was taking place. It's possible that he became aware that he was riding in a vehicle with a person who had no intention of driving him to the gas station. It's possible that a disagreement broke out. The last time anyone ever heard from him was when he committed suicide. What happened next is unknown, but it seems likely he was taken to a different, secondary location. He was either slain on purpose or restrained and left to expire as a result of exposure to the weather. Both of these events took place at that location. The people responsible then held onto his body for some period of time. After several days, perhaps when they felt the initial search efforts were dying down or moving to other areas, they decided to dispose of his body. They chose a remote location, a place where he was unlikely to be found quickly, but a place that might eventually be discovered. They transported his body up that hillside, possibly carrying him to avoid leaving footprints. They placed him carefully in the snow, removing his pants and boots before they left. Why they took those items is a mystery. Perhaps it was to remove any potential DNA evidence that might have been on them. Or maybe, in a more disturbing twist, they were taken as a kind of trophy. This reconstruction is the only one that accounts for all the impossible evidence found at the scene. It explains why there were no tracks in the snow. It explains why his feet and socks were clean. It explains why his pants and boots were missing and never found. But because the case was officially closed as an accident, this is all just theory. The troubling questions remain unanswered. Who did Dylan encounter after he left the party? What was said or done that led to that terrified phone call? And who would go to such elaborate lengths to stage a death scene to look like an accident, only to do it so poorly that it was full of impossible contradictions? For the family of Dylan Parker, these questions are a constant, haunting presence. They are left with the memory of their son and the knowledge that the truth of what happened to him was dismissed and buried along with him, leaving a cold case in the snows of Idaho that may never be solved. You are very much appreciated for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was a really experienced outdoorsman, decided he was going to go on a simple one-night hike. The spot he chose was the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Now, the name of these mountains has a few different origin stories, but the one that most people agree on is pretty telling. For a long, long time, people have been afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have happened there over the years. And because so many people would avoid the area out of a fear of some mysterious end, the place just became known as the Superstitious Mountains. But Sam, he wasn't superstitious at all. In fact, he came out here all the time to go hiking. He had a favorite trail, a particular 8-mile loop that wound its way through a deep canyon. It was beautiful, challenging, and he knew it like the back of his hand. And so, this one-night trip he had planned was going to be on that same 8-mile loop. The plan was simple. He'd hike 4 miles in, find a good spot to camp for the night, and then hike the 4 miles back out the next morning. He had planned to do it with a good friend of his, but at the very last minute, his friend had to cancel. Something came up, and he just couldn't make it. So, Sam was on the fence. He teetered on the edge of just calling the whole thing off. But in the end, he thought, you know what, I'll just do it by myself. I'm so familiar with this trail, with this area. What could possibly go wrong? On the day he was supposed to leave for the hike, his plan was to get to the trailhead early in the day. That way, he'd have the maximum amount of sunlight to get his 4 miles in and set up camp without any pressure. But life doesn't always go according to plan. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, a mix of bad traffic getting out of the city and some unexpectedly rough road conditions on the dirt roads leading to the trail, he didn't actually get to the trailhead until 5:45 inches the evening. The sun was already getting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. Sam knew deep down that it was a bad idea to start a hike this late. He was going to run out of daylight fast. He probably wasn't going to make it the full 4 miles to the specific point where he had planned on camping out. But he was young, he was fit, and he was confident. He figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably move quickly, maybe even jog part of it, and make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark. He knew from past hikes that there were some other suitable campsites in that area, not his preferred one, but they would do. And so he decided he would kind of risk it. He would just try to go as fast as he could and use what little daylight he had left to reach a safe place to spend the night. But the trail was tougher than he remembered, or maybe it was the fading light playing tricks on him. He wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could. The ground was uneven, and he had to watch his footing carefully. And soon enough, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world went from gold to purple to a deep, inky black. It was totally dark. He had his flashlight, of course, but that only cut a small, shaky circle of light into the oppressive darkness. It was only able to shine maybe 10 feet in front of him. Beyond that, the wilderness was a complete mystery. And then, at one point, as he was navigating a rocky section of the trail, he nearly fell. His foot slipped, and he tumbled sideways, catching himself just before he went over the edge of a rock. He knew if he had fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt. And the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was 15 miles away from the nearest help. He was in a bad cell phone service area, meaning his phone was basically useless. The roads getting out here were treacherous, especially in the dark. And nobody, not even his parents, knew exactly where he was on this trail. It dawned on him in that moment that he'd made a pretty bad choice. He realized he should stop right now, make camp wherever he was, and not try to risk it any further. And as it happened, right where he stopped, there was a forest nearby. He shined his light off the path and into the trees, and he could see a clearing about 30 feet away. He walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. It was flat, sheltered by the trees, and even better, on the edge of this clearing was the remnant of an old fire pit. It was very old, just a circle of blackened rocks, but it at least showed that someone had camped out right here before. And they seemed to have made it just fine. Suddenly, he was feeling pretty smart again. He felt like he'd made a good call, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam had intentionally not brought a tent. He was the kind of outdoorsman who liked to sleep on a simple sleeping pad with a warm sleeping bag over that. And then he would string up a tarp over the top of him just in case it rained. Since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of tall pine trees, he was able to easily string up his tarp between 2 of them. It was perfect. And pretty soon, he had a small, crackling fire going in the old fire pit. The flames pushed back the darkness and the cold, and he felt a sense of comfort. He cracked open a can of beans and began eating his dinner, watching the fire dance. But as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off. Something was not right. It was a subtle feeling at first, like a prickle on the back of his neck. He began scanning the tree line around his small camp as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary. But his visibility was incredibly limited. If you've ever sat right next to a campfire in a dark forest, you know that your visibility is basically a 5-foot circle around the fire. The bright light of the flames ruins your night vision, and you really can't see beyond that bubble of light. His vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him and nothing else. He started thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. I'm alone, it's late, and I can't see what's out there. It makes sense that I'd feel a little on edge. But as he was rationalizing this bad gut feeling, a rock about the size of a marble came soaring into the campsite and landed at his feet with a soft thud. He looked down at the rock. It was just a plain gray rock. But immediately, he connected that rock to the sense of dread he had been feeling. The feeling wasn't just in his head. Something had thrown that rock. He was looking around a little more aggressively now, his head on a swivel, his eyes trying to pierce the darkness beyond his fire. But again, his vision was very, very limited. He was effectively blind to whatever was out there in the woods. And so, for the next 15 minutes, Sam sat there completely still, really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening as intently as he possibly could. He didn't hear anything. He didn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so, he began to rationalize again. He started to convince himself that there was nothing wrong here. That feeling I have? Oh, don't worry about that. He started telling himself, I must have kicked a rock when I was setting up camp, and it just landed now. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree branch. But either way, it's something totally explainable, and you've got nothing to worry about. After a little while of repeating this to himself, he convinced himself. He got into his sleeping bag under his tarp, put his head down, and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam woke up. He didn't know why, he just snapped awake. And he had that same sense of dread, but now it was back with a vengeance. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling. He couldn't hear anything. He couldn't see anything. But he was definitely feeling like something was wrong. And at that moment, as he was lying there, listening really intently and looking really carefully into the dark, he heard the sound of rustling leaves. It sounded exactly like someone walking through dry leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. Initially, he couldn't tell if this person, or maybe an animal, was walking towards his campsite or away from it. The sound was just there, a steady crunching in the dark. But over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds started to fade. And he convinced himself that, okay, they've left. Whatever it was, it's gone now, and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, just to be sure. And so he reached next to him to the spot where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier. And he couldn't find his flashlight. He started patting the ground around him, feeling for it. He looked around for it, but he couldn't find it. And he's thinking, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body. And it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells started going off in his head. Because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumped out of his sleeping bag. He ducked out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping, trying to find this flashlight. And as he's looking out of the corner of his eye, he saw some light. He turned his head, and in the exact same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still lying down, he saw his flashlight It was laying on the ground about 10 meters away from him, and it was on. The beam was pointing away from him into the trees, which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless. And they had moved it all the way over there. Immediately, Sam thought to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. They want me to leave the safety of my fire and walk into the darkness to get my flashlight. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit. But he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he put his boots on and he grabbed his knife. And he knew he was not leaving this campsite. In fact, he was going to build the biggest fire he could. He was going to stoke that fire as big as he could get it, and he was not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite, holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck was out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps. They would approach his campsite, circle around it, and then turn around and leave. And he noticed a pattern. Every time the fire got lower, the footsteps would come closer and closer and closer. And when he would throw more wood on and stoke the fire, making it roar back to life, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 in the morning, he ran out of firewood. So unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out. And he was certainly not going into the woods. That was the whole point, to avoid the woods where this thing was. And so, as the fire slowly died down, turning from flames to glowing embers, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next. Because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in. It had already come all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he heard the footsteps approaching. And before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away that it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walked right up to about 3 meters away. But they intentionally came up behind the thickest group of trees so he couldn't see them. And it was still dark outside, and he was in that small bubble of light near the dying fire, so he was blind to whatever was on the other side of those trees. But he knew they were there, and they had stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid stood in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever was behind the trees. His imagination was probably going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees. He was just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved. It turned around and ran away, crashing through the underbrush. And it did not come back. And so, when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there. He was still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight. And then he packed up everything he had, and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot. He got back into his car, locked the doors, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car, and he went inside, and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. He walked over to see what it was. And in the dust, someone had simply written, "Sleep well?" Sam is confident that whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now, Sam just wonders what would have happened if he had tried to retrieve that flashlight. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 in the morning on the first night they were there, the girl woke up because she had to go to the bathroom. She was about to unzip her tent when she stopped, because she heard some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something, a raccoon maybe. And so she began to unzip the tent. There was a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent, so the moonlight was pouring through. She had plenty of illumination, and so she looked through this tiny hole, and she couldn't believe what she saw. It was a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back was to them, so she couldn't see that the girl was looking through the tent. And she was feverishly digging into the ground in front of her with her bare hands. The girl literally fell backwards into her tent. She was so startled by what she saw. And she landed on her boyfriend, who immediately got up and was like, "What's going on?" And she just went, "Shh." And she pointed at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent. And she just whispered, "Look." The boy was confused, but he could tell his girlfriend was very serious. So he sat up quietly and he looked through the little opening in the door. And he saw the digging woman. The boy recoiled and looked at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He took a flashlight and his girlfriend was telling him, "Don't do it." But he opened up the tent a little bit more and he aimed his flashlight directly on this woman. And this got her attention. She stopped digging and she stood up slowly. And she turned around and faced them. And she had no expression. She wasn't giving them any indication why she was there. She wasn't acting aggressive. She wasn't acting scared. She was just completely neutral. And she stood there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite into the darkness. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they opened their tent all the way. They went outside, they kind of scanned around with their flashlights, and she was nowhere to be found. And they went to where she was digging, and it was just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There was no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here, and maybe they'll do something about it. And so, feeling pretty confident that this woman was not going to come back, they both went back into the tent. They zipped it shut, they got in their sleeping bags, and they were about to go to sleep when they heard someone running towards their campsite. And they knew it was this woman. They immediately unzipped the tent and they looked out. And now the woman wasn't digging anymore. She was rummaging through some of their stuff that was outside of their tent. And the way she was doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and then just throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy got out, and he shined a light on her, and he said, "You need to leave." And she didn't react. She just kept flipping through all their stuff until he got pretty forceful and said, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stopped and looked at him like, "Huh? What are you doing here?" And then she got up, turned around, and walked away. Now the couple really didn't know what to do because she was clearly willing to come back after being confronted, but they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she was an animal. They were just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time, and she seemed to really get it. They both did go back in the tent, and as soon as they zipped it shut, they heard her come running straight back to the site. It was like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time, she ran back to the hole in the ground, and she was just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she could. And this time, they came out of their tent, and they were mad. And they were screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seemed to kind of frighten the woman, who got up and she looked at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she ran away. And it looked almost animalistic, the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl were totally shaken up at this point. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just kept coming back to their site, and they didn't know what to do about it. So they turned on some lanterns, and they turned on their flashlights, and they decided, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way, we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they'd been outside for 2 hours. They were getting cold, they were super tired, and the woman was nowhere to be found. And so they finally said, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They got back in their sleeping bags and they went to sleep. They didn't hear her again. The next morning, when they got up and they unzipped their tent, they looked outside and all of their stuff had been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug, that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep, was now well over a foot deep. And they realized this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing. And there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken, but she didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened. But the ranger had no idea what to make of it. He'd never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just left that day because they were not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eban and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eban turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. They went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eban and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out. And any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There were no birds. There were no animals. It was just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what? This is private property. Not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally made it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They got all settled in, they were getting ready to see some animals, and all day long, they didn't see a single animal. They didn't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it was just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand. And they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour, farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which was perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eban's father said, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? And Eban was like, yeah, why not? So they hiked a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind. And once again, they didn't see any animals. It was totally quiet. And so they turned around, and they started heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eban's father turned to him and said, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben said, no, it couldn't have been the wind. Because all day today, we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Iban's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Iban was like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walked into their campsite and they looked down at their tent and they were really confused at what they saw. The two rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points. Or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decided, you know what? It can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that? If they came to our campsite, why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent right. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent right, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they built their tent again and they made a little fire. And they stayed up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguished the fire, they got in the tent, and they both fell asleep. A couple hours later, Iban woke up suddenly. And he wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not, but he thought he heard someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Iban instinctively turned to make sure his dad was still in the tent with him, and he was. And then Iban started listening really intently to what was happening outside. And all he could hear was silence, like it had been since they got in the woods. He didn't hear any more laughter. And so he said, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there. And eventually, Iban went back to sleep. A little while later, Eben woke up suddenly again. Except this time, his dad was already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sat up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Iban listened. And to his horror, he heard laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Iban also realized the laughter was not coming from the same area he had heard it. It was now coming from the opposite direction, and it was a lot closer to them. Iban very quietly and carefully explained to his dad that he had actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Iban's father turned to Iban and said, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turned their attention back to just listening because they were hoping this was just going to stop and whatever this was just going to leave. But it didn't leave. They heard footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it was so quiet, it was really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this was charging towards them. And then it came to a complete stop, right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben was now grabbing on to his father. Iban's father was holding on to his rifle, and he was getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever was out there. And right before he grabbed the zipper, this person, whatever it was, started laughing again. And it was practically right on top of them. It was so loud, they could hear it clear as day, right there, right outside their tent. And Eban's father took a deep breath. He grabbed the zipper, and as soon as he began moving it, the sound the zipper made caused the laughter to stop. They didn't hear footsteps, so they knew probably something was still out there, but the laughter stopped. Like it recognized that they were making noise. They were right there. They were in the tent. Eban's father froze with his hand on this zipper, and he was debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he could even make that decision, whatever this thing was turned around and ran back into the woods. And it was just gone. And for several minutes, they just sat like that, in total silence, praying that whatever this was gone for good. And after several minutes, when they didn't hear anything, there was no more laughing, there was no more running, Eban's father re-zipped up the tent, put his hand back down, and they were both left, just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eban and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it was so quiet, sound traveled really far. And they didn't know who or what was out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they were just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there. Literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated and private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington State. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals, or maybe one animal, moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically, he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he was just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looked up directly at Matt and made eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes went wide, and he stood up, turned around, and ran away from Matt's campsite. Matt had no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzipped his tent, jumped outside, and shined his light into the forest looking for this guy. He was thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington State. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt was trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he was thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby. And he was looking around into the total darkness. He was looking through all the trees. Any light source anywhere out there, he would see. And there was not one. There was no fire, there was no flashlight, there was nothing. And so eventually, Matt went back inside of his tent. He zipped it up, and he was just left kind of dumbfounded. He couldn't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason, and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally, the sun came up again, and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and, stranger things have happened. So that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing, and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire, and he was eating some food near his fire. And then, as he was sitting there, he heard rustling coming from behind him. And he was pretty sure it was an animal, so he turned around and he didn't see anything, and he went back to eating his food. And then, a little while later, he heard some more rustling behind him. And this time, he couldn't really just write it off. Clearly, there was something behind him that was moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless, and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he heard a man's voice come out of the darkness that said, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" And Matt's heart started racing. He knew that even though he couldn't see him, it had to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they were in the middle of nowhere. He hadn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly, this guy had the ability to sneak up on him. And so he was thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just said, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there was silence. And Matt, one part of him was thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him was thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost, and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon. And they'll come into the light, it'll be a big relief, I'll send them on their merry way, and everything will be fine. But as Matt was having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows did not come any closer, but instead asked the same question, a bit more forcefully this time. Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This was not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There was something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he was all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again. And now he knew it was the same guy. This guy had been following him for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified. And this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice. Except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up. And the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt. And he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him. But he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here was so rough, he was going to fall, get hurt, he was going to get lost. And this guy was already long gone. He had somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just went back to his campsite, and he was thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car. and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course, I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he was going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. Then the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles. And so the likelihood that he was still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched. He was totally terrified. And then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He was still in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy was still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite, and then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he was looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy was following him. At this point, it wasn't even a question. He was somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy had left me alone finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he was laying there from somewhere out in the woods, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say. So he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves. And then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up, and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved, and he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy. But he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? In the summer of 1906, there was this couple, Dr. William Clark and his wife Harriet. They were up in northwestern Connecticut, and they were driving along this winding country road in a place called Litchfield County. As they were driving along, it was so scenic and beautiful, with rolling hills and green everywhere. What they were doing was looking for a location in this area that could serve as a location for their second home. Doctor Clark was an oncologist, and they lived back in New York City, where he and his wife lived kind of a fabulous life. He was super successful. He was not only an oncologist, he was a big-time professor as well. And so they lived this amazing life in New York. But their lives were really hectic. New York City is a hectic place. Add in the fact that they were very social people, always going out and going to functions and this and that. And so they had some extra money, and they wanted to buy or build a second home that would kind of serve as their retreat away from the city. After looking all around the country, they found Litchfield County was kind of like the opposite of New York City. Very few people were living there at the time, and again, it was this beautiful, scenic place. And so it just seemed kind of like the perfect spot. So again, Dr. Clark and Harriet, they're just driving along on a beautiful day. And they eventually, in Litchfield County, they reach this beautiful red wood-covered bridge, and they go over it. And when they got to the other side, their field of view opened up because there weren't as many trees right on the other side of this bridge. And they suddenly had this view up and to the right, maybe half a mile away or something, of this weirdly shaded forest. Now you have to remember that basically everywhere they were looking, there were trees everywhere. It was very densely forested. But there was just this one kind of rise, like a pretty big prominent hill that was really dark, like totally shaded. And it was because there were two mountains or two hills on either side of it, almost creating like a valley. And so it just looked like, wow, that's a very shaded forest. And as you'll see, it's actually called the Dark Entry Forest, in part because of how shaded it is. And so they had just come out of this bridge, and they were seeing this area up on this hill. There were no buildings, nothing. It was just trees. And there was just something immediately about it that really stood out to Dr. Clark and his wife. And they noticed that the road they were on, there appeared to be like an access road that kind of splintered off the road they were on that appeared to go up into that forest, the Dark Entry Forest. And so they looked at each other and they were like, hey, let's go up there. Maybe that's the place where we can find our spot for our second home. And so Dr. Clark pulled off the main road, went on the access road, and he began making his way up towards this kind of darkened forest area. And really quickly, the road itself was very overgrown. At first, it seemed like it was relatively well maintained, but the farther up they went towards this dark forest, the rougher it got. To the point where Dr. Clark couldn't even drive on it. There were too many potholes and everything. So they ended up pulling the car over and parking. And at this point, they were actually in a bit of a clearing, and they could actually see up ahead of them where they parked. It looked almost like an entry point to the forest. The tree line was right in front of them, and there was kind of like a gap in the trees where this rugged road kind of continued into the forest, and they continued walking on foot towards the entry of this forest. Again, it was a beautiful, scenic, very sunny, beautiful day. They were super excited, and they walked into the shade of the forest, and right away, it was like all the sunlight basically vanished. But not in a spooky way, kind of like they lowered the brightness slightly. And it was very quiet. The canopy in Dark Entry Forest is known for being really, really thick, and so not much light was pushing through. But it created almost like they were walking into a bubble. It was just pure, unadulterated silence and peace. And as they were walking on this road, which quickly became mostly like a little path, it didn't even look like a road at some point. It was just kind of like grass that had been pushed down. Clearly, not many people or anything were coming into this forest, at least not from this direction. And as they were walking along, they were looking around, and they were like, this place is so beautiful. I mean, it was already beautiful, but this was especially beautiful. Like they walked maybe a couple hundred feet into the forest, and off to their right was this apple orchard. Untouched, no one was taking these apples. It was just like a wild apple orchard. And there were deer that were just eating the apples off the tree. And they were looking over at Dr. Clark and his wife, and they were completely unafraid. They didn't see people, so this was not terrifying for them. Deer just eating their apples. And then on the other side of the road, there were these huge fields full of flowers that, again, trees were everywhere, but there were all these flowers at the bases of the trees. Lilies and roses and yellow bitter tansies, or things, that's what they're called. So all of these beautiful flowers. And then at some point, as they walked a little bit farther into this dark entry forest, the sunlight that was poking through, it was hitting the ground in such a way that it was actually sparkling. Because this forest was actually on a hillside, and there was this mineral called mica. If you're familiar, it's like this little translucent, it almost looks like kind of clouded glass that's actually a mineral that comes from the ground. And when the sunlight hits it, it kind of looks like it sparkles. And so they were looking around at these wild animals that were unafraid of them, and flowers, and there were babbling brooks and streams. I mean, it was like out of a Disney movie. This was like a perfect place. And so by the time the couple came out of Dark Entry Forest, and this was only, they walked around for maybe an hour or so, by the time they were coming out, they were completely sold that that was going to be where they went ahead and bought their land to build a second home. And so they went back to New York City and they put in the paperwork to buy the land. And they bought 1,000 acres in this forest, which is ridiculous to imagine, just casually buying 1,000 acres anywhere. But they did. They bought their 1,000 acres. And as soon as they had it, as soon as it was finalized, Dr. Clark began calling around to all these builders, local builders in Connecticut, that could help him build his home. And he had no intention of building some humongous home. They bought a huge amount of land, but they only wanted to build a small cabin. But despite the job being relatively simple, and despite Dr. Clark offering quite a bit of money to anybody who was willing to go out there and build this for him, none of the builders would do it. They never really gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they would not go into Dark Entry Forest. But universally, no one would do it. And so Dr. Clark, he definitely was discouraged by that, but he just kind of chalked it up to, okay, so obviously it's kind of an isolated place. It's relatively hard to get into Dark Entry Forest. And where they had bought this land, it was pretty far into the forest. And so he just decided, okay, it just might not be worth it for them. It's logistically kind of a nightmare. They don't want to do it. And so Dr. Clark was undeterred, and he decided he would just build the house himself. Dr. Clark, he grew up on a farm in New Jersey. He was a very handy guy. He had built buildings before, so this was something he could do. And so over the next several months, every weekend, Dr. Clark would make his way on his own to Dark Entry Forest. And it also was full of owls that were hooting all the time. So there was like this audio of being in this forest, which was really intense. Like there were owls hooting constantly. And actually, Dr. Clark and Harriet thought it was really cute that these owls, it seemed like they were almost personally greeting them as they came into the forest. And so Dr. Clark, every weekend for several months, he would go into Dark Entry Forest and be greeted by the owls. And he would go to the land where the 1,000-acre land was, and actually he had identified this one kind of flat spot in the 1,000 acres that was good for building a home. And so the first thing he did over these several weekends he was out there is he just cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees, just kind of clearing out that flat area. And then he chopped up the trees, he cut down into lumber, and he used that to build a rustic, simple 2-story cabin. And then after this cabin was built, kind of up on this hill, there happened to be another hill not too far away from the cabin where there was a freshwater spring right at the top. And so Dr. Clark, he went up and laid piping from the freshwater spring down to his cabin, so they had fresh water in the cabin. And then down the hill from where the cabin was constructed was a small brook and Doctor. Clark, he found himself always going down and just staring into this beautiful brook because there were all these trout, because nobody fished out here. This was like an abandoned place, basically. There were all these trout just swimming around, unencumbered, just leaping out of the water. And so he ended up actually building a swimming pool right next to the brook, specifically so he could sit in the swimming pool and watch the trout. And so by Thanksgiving of that year, so 1906, by Thanksgiving, the property was done. The cabin had been built, everything was done. And so that holiday season, Dr. Clark and Harriet and their whole family would come out and they would spend the holidays, sitting in their pool, watching the trout and just having a wonderful time. And really, for many years, every summer and every major holiday, the Clark family would come out to their beautiful dark entry cabin and they would stay there. And it was really perfect. That is until 1918. In 1918, in the summer, Dr. Clark and Harriet were at their cabin and they were having a nice time when Dr. Clark got word that he was actually being called back to New York City for an emergency. Remember, he's an oncologist, so these things happen. And he was called back. And for whatever reason, Harriet, who normally likely would have joined him and just gone back to New York with him, she decided to stay. I mean, they had been coming here for years by this point, so she probably felt somewhat comfortable. Although admittedly, she was very unhappy about this. She didn't want to be there alone. But again, she decided to stay. But she told Dr. Clark, because she didn't know how long he would actually be in New York, and he didn't really know either, but she said, "You have to promise me you'll be back here as soon as you possibly can." And Dr. Clark would tell her that, I'll do my best, should be back here in maybe, a couple of days from now. And I promise you, I will come home as soon as I possibly can. And so Dr. Clark packed up his things, and he and his wife, they left their cabin. They walked their way down the trail, listening to the owls and looking at the mica sparkling on the ground. And they left the forest, and they made their way to a nearby train station, which actually was not that far away from the entry to the forest. And Harriet dropped off her husband, and she watched as he boarded and it began taking off, and he disappeared to go to New York. And Dr. Clark, as he's vanishing, traveling on this train, he's thinking to himself that, okay, I'll be in New York just for a couple of days, I'll be home, I'll be back in no time. Little did he know, over the course of time he was going to be in New York, his wife would endure something that is just truly horrifying. So before I explain to you what happened after Dr. Clark left, you need to understand some history about this forest. History that Dr. Clark and Harriet did not look into before deciding to purchase these 1,000 acres. Because had they done the research into this area, they likely would not have bought the land. So there actually used to be a town that was settled in the Dark Entry Forest. It was called Dudleytown, and it was settled in the 1740s. And at first, it was just a couple of families just getting by. But pretty quickly, it grew to about 30 families and several structures and houses and the whole 9 yards. It was a small community inside of this beautiful forest, and things were great. For a small town in the 1700s, things were stable. But starting in the end of the 1700s, like in the 1790s, up till about the 1800s, things started to go really, really badly in Dudleytown. And in fact, because of how badly it went, it earned this conclusion that Dudleytown had to be cursed. And that lore had spread around, which is actually why those builders refused to do the work for Dr. Clark, because they believed it was a cursed place. So this is what led to it being believed to be cursed. And I'll tell you, it's pretty creepy. So it started with the Carter family. The Carter family was a big family inside of Dudleytown. And it was in 1792, there was this cholera epidemic that broke out in this small town. And 6 members of the Carter family died really suddenly from cholera. And the remaining members of the Carter family, which was significant, I think there were a dozen people still left, might have been a few less than that, but a pretty good chunk of people, they were so grief-stricken from the loss that they decided to just literally abandon their houses in Dudleytown and go back to New York City, where they happened to be from as well, same as Dr. Clark. But as soon as they got to New York, they were massacred by natives that lived in the area. And the only people that survived this massacre were 3 children. And the 3 children were kidnapped and never seen again. And so that was the start of bad things happening to people in Dudleytown. The next thing that happened is there was a guy named Hollister. We don't know his last name, but he either fell off a roof or he was pushed. We don't really know, but either way, he died. But he died on or near another person's home, whose name was Tanner. So Hollister died and died on or near Tanner's home. And after Hollister died, which again, it was shrouded in mystery, Tanner, the owner of the home where this guy died, he began talking obsessively, and it's documented, obsessively about strange creatures lurking around the tree line inside of Dark Entry Forest, right around Dudleytown every night. That was all he saw. So a guy dies, and all of a sudden, Tanner is noticing all these strange creatures. And he's telling everybody in town that there's something going on here. Nobody believed him. And so slowly, Tanner, every night, he would see whatever he was seeing, and it drove him insane, completely insane, to the point where he couldn't even function, and his wife and his daughter had to take care of him until he passed away. And as Tanner was losing his mind, his next-door neighbor, whose name was Abel, began to talk as well about these creatures that were coming to the edge of the tree line surrounding Dudleytown most nights. And just like Tanner, Abel as well slowly lost his mind over these creatures because nobody believed him. And then all the way up until just past the 1800s, so many people just randomly died in Dudleytown. Some from disease, for sure, but others, they'd just be found dead. And then many people as well began citing these strange creatures that were lurking all around. By 1900, the only family that was still alive in Dudleytown was this family called the Brophies. And it was a fairly big family. And the mother, she suddenly died of cholera. The 2 sons, they were accused of theft in another town and then fled and vanished. And so literally, it was down to John Brophy, the actual last person who was living in Dudleytown. And one night, he didn't know why, apparently, but his cabin burned to the ground. And after his cabin, or while his cabin was burning, people were called out, they saw the smoke, they came out to put out this fire. And the last anyone saw of John, who had lost his whole family, he'd lost everything, is he just turned and walked deeper and deeper into the forest and was never seen again. And no one could find him. That was it. And that was the last person who lived in Dudleytown. And that marked the moment that Dudleytown went from still being occupied to being a literal ghost town. And you can actually look up the newspaper article that documented the moment when Dudleytown became a ghost town. No one lived there. A few years later is when Dr. Clark and Harriet were taking their stroll through Litchfield County and up into Dark Entry Forest and saying, wow, this is the place for us. And they saw the ruins of Dudleytown. They walked past the crumbling foundations of these old homes, and there were all these remnants of this town that was still there. But much the way they viewed the owls as being kind of charming, they also viewed this rundown old town that was gone as kind of cute. And it made them want to stay there more. So they were aware of the town, but didn't do the research. Apparently, Dudleytown was cursed, and that is where they bought their land. So fast forward to 1918. Dr. Clark, he's left for this emergency trip to New York, and it would turn out he was only needed in New York for 36 hours. It was as short as he could have expected it to be. So, less than 2 days later, keeping his word to his wife, he was back on a train and he was heading back to that stop where Harriet had dropped him off near the Dark Entry Forest. And although this was rare, that Dr. Clark would leave his wife in the cabin. He expected her to be waiting for him at the train station. They didn't have an exact time that he was going to be there because it wasn't entirely planned, but he had said, I'll be here in like 1 or 2 days max. And so he just kind of expected his wife to check the schedule and be at the train platform. But as he's pulling into the station, he sees his wife is not there. Now, this was not some huge cause for concern, but it was enough of a red flag that as he's pulling into the station, Dr. Clark was thinking, something feels off. And so he ended up going from the train station, and he actually walked the rest of the way. He didn't take a car or anything. He walked to that access road and made his way up to the entry of Dark Entry Forest. And as soon as he walked into the forest, so it was daylight out, he stepped into the canopy, and it was dark again. And remember, it used to feel so welcoming and wonderful going into that forest. It was so peaceful. But now, it had a different feel. He stepped into the forest, and suddenly, it felt threatening. It felt ominous. And the owls that were hooting the whole time he stepped in, it didn't feel like they were greeting him. It felt like they were telling him to leave. But he had to find his wife, and he was thinking, she's up at the cabin, that's where we need to go. And so he began kind of jogging, fast walking. He was getting a little nervous through the forest. And as he was moving through, the sounds of these owls were getting louder and louder and louder and more threatening, until finally, when he got to the clearing, when he could actually look up and see where he built his cabin up on this hill, it was like a cacophony of noise. It was just constant hooting, almost like it didn't even sound like hooting. It was just a loud sound that was constant. And so Dr. Clark was starting to panic. But he got even more panicked when he looked up at the cabin. He didn't see his wife, but he saw the front door to this cabin, was slightly ajar. And so Dr. Clark, he ran the rest of the way up the hill, owls hooting the whole time. He got to the door, and he was terrified. He knew there was something wrong here, but he got the courage, he opened up the front door, and the second he stepped into this home, which he had loved and spent years and years in with his family, he stepped in, and everything was different. Instead of it being peaceful, he now felt this almost high-pitched sound, like inside of his head for a second. And he was confused. And then he heard what sounded like maniacal laughter coming from the second floor. He didn't see anybody on the first floor. He thought it was his wife. And so he charged upstairs. He got to the landing, and he saw the door to his bedroom, where he would expect his wife to be, was slightly open. And he could hear this laughter coming from inside of this room, this maniacal, crazy, loud, high-pitched laughter. And he was totally panicked. He went to the door, and he opened it up. And there, in the back corner of the bedroom, was his wife. And she was in the fetal position. And her mouth had been opened as wide as it could go. And the laughter that he was hearing was coming out of her body, but her jaw wasn't moving. Her chest was heaving, and this maniacal laughter was just coming out of her as she stared him dead in the eyes. And so Dr. Clark, he was so terrified at what he was seeing and all the hooting and all this craziness going on that he just turned and ran away. We don't know what happened to Harriet Clark over those 36 hours that her husband was gone, but something happened to her. And when she was taken away from this cabin, the only thing she would say is, the strange creatures kept coming back. I kept seeing strange creatures, the same thing that all the people in Dudleytown had said that caused them to flee the town. And so we don't know exactly what became of Harriet. There is one account that says she was forever. She went to a mental hospital and stayed there until she passed. Another account says she went back to New York with Dr. Clark, where she took her life. But either way, the final thing was she claimed to have seen the strange creatures and lost her mind as well. Following this story, Dark Entry Forest really took on this unbelievable legend. I mean, people knew about this story. They knew about the legend of the 1700s and 1800s, but this felt recent. This was a documented case of this doctor's wife. And so it spawned a lot of people going into Dark Entry Forest to see what's out there. And lots of people who went into that forest before it became illegal reported feeling phantom hands slapping them on the back and feeling really intense pockets of cold air. And actually, the very famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, in the 1970s, they went out and ran a special series about what happened in the Dark Entry Forest. And they came out and said, absolutely, that forest is demonically possessed. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi McKay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musi and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musi was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musi wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musi was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musi and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musi finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musi felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musi went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferriera-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musi had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musi took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musi just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grasp. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, catalogued, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal. And this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium, and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang! The starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So, he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So, Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20-mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.